When Caleb Ward's fist slammed into the table at 3 in the morning, Eliza knew everything was about to fall apart. The most powerful rancher in Wyoming stood in her kitchen, this man who never showed weakness, with blood on his knuckles and terror in his eyes. "They're coming for the ranch at sunrise," he said, "and I can't stop them alone." Outside, the blizzard screamed. Inside, Eliza faced an impossible choice: run back to her safe, invisible life in town, or stand beside the man she loved and fight for something that might destroy them both. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this journey travels. The bread wasn't rising. Eliza Boone stood in the cramped bakery kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, staring at dough that refused to cooperate, and tried not to see it as a metaphor for her entire existence. 34 years old. Unmarried. Unremarkable. The kind of woman people's eyes slid past without stopping, like she was part of the furniture in Medicine Ridge, Wyoming. She'd stopped minding, mostly. Stopped hoping, anyway. The wind rattled the windows hard enough to make her flinch. December had arrived mean this year, bringing snow that piled higher than wagon wheels and temperatures that made breathing hurt. 3 days now since the blizzard started. 3 days of watching the town slowly suffocate under white. Eliza punched down the stubborn dough harder than necessary. Her hands were thick, capable, scarred from years of burns and cuts that came with the work. Not delicate. Not the kind of hands that made men write poetry. Fine. She didn't need poetry. She needed this bread to rise before the pounding on the front door nearly stopped her heart. Nobody knocked at this hour. Nobody knocked on her door at any hour, really, except to pick up orders they'd already paid for. Eliza wiped flour across her apron and moved toward the sound, her pulse doing something uncomfortable in her throat. Through the frosted glass, she could make out a shape, large, male, covered in snow. "We're closed," she called out, hating how her voice shook. "Miss Boone." The voice was rough, exhausted. "I need to speak with you, please." She knew that voice. Everyone in Medicine Ridge knew that voice. Caleb Ward didn't say please to anyone. Eliza's hands fumbled with the lock. The door swung inward, bringing a blast of wind so cold it felt like being slapped. And there he stood, the man who owned half the territory, looking like he'd barely survived a war. Snow caked his hat, his coat, his shoulders. Ice clung to his dark beard. His eyes, gray, sharp, the kind that usually made men step back, looked hollowed out by something beyond physical exhaustion. "Mr. Ward," Eliza managed. "What?" "My cook left." He cut straight through pleasantries like they were weeds. "Took off 3 days ago when the storm hit. Got 15 men at the ranch, no food, and I've got cattle dying in drifts faster than we can dig them out. I need someone who can feed a crew. I need someone now." Eliza stared at him. "At this hour?" "I've been riding since midnight." His jaw tightened. "You're the 4th door I've knocked on. Everyone else turned me down flat, said the roads are too dangerous, said I'm asking too much." He paused, and something in his expression shifted. "They're probably right, but I'm asking anyway." She should say no. Any reasonable person would say no. The Ward Ranch sat 8 miles outside town, and the road there was barely passable in good weather. In this storm, it was suicide. "How much does it pay?" she heard herself ask. Caleb blinked like he'd expected immediate rejection and didn't quite know what to do with questions. $75 a month, room and board. You'd have your own cabin." $75. Eliza currently made 30 working 70-hour weeks in this bakery that belonged to someone else, living in a room above the shop that was more closet than bedroom. "The roads," she started. "I know." He didn't look away. "I won't lie to you, Miss Boone. It's dangerous getting there, dangerous staying, probably. Winter's only going to get worse, but I'll keep you safe. That's a promise." The wind howled between them. Snow swirled into the bakery, melting into dark spots on the floorboards. "When would we leave?" Eliza asked. "Soon as you can pack." Insane. This was insane. She'd lived her entire life being careful, being small, being safe. Safe meant invisible, yes, but invisible meant alive. But invisible also meant standing in this bakery for the rest of her life, alone, watching bread that wouldn't rise. "Give me 20 minutes, Eliza said. The wagon ride to Ward Ranch tested every religious conviction Eliza had ever pretended to hold. She'd packed fast: clothes, a few books, her mother's recipe box, the good knives she'd bought with money saved over 2 years. Everything fit in one battered trunk. Her whole life, reduced to luggage that barely filled a wagon bed. Caleb had loaded it without comment, then helped her onto the seat with a hand that was surprisingly gentle for someone with his reputation. She'd heard the stories. Everyone had. Caleb Ward was hard, ruthless, the kind of man who'd built his empire through sheer force of will and wasn't afraid to crush anyone who got in his way. The man who'd just spent 10 minutes making sure her trunk was secured properly didn't quite match the legend. "There's blankets behind the seat," he said, taking up the reins. "Storm's worse than it looks." Eliza pulled a thick wool blanket across her lap, but within minutes she understood what he meant. The storm wasn't worse than it looked. It was worse than anything her imagination could have conjured. Wind that felt like fists, snow that blinded, cold that found every gap in clothing and dug straight to bone. The horses struggled forward, their breathing harsh and labored. Caleb drove with his whole body tense, fighting to keep them on what passed for a road. Eliza couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. For all she knew, they were heading straight off a cliff. "How can you tell where we're going?" she shouted over the wind. "Can't," Caleb shouted back. "Just hoping the horses remember." Wonderful. She was going to die in a blizzard with a man she barely knew, trying to reach a ranch that might not even be there anymore. Something heavy landed across her shoulders. Eliza jerked in surprise, then realized Caleb had taken off his own coat, a heavy sheepskin thing that probably weighed 15 pounds, and draped it over her blanket. "You'll freeze," she protested. "I'm fine." He didn't look at her, all his attention on the road that wasn't really there. His shirt was already plastered to his shoulders with snow. He was absolutely not fine. "Mr. Ward." "Caleb," he corrected. "If you're risking your life to save my ranch, least you can do is use my name." The coat was still warm from his body. It smelled like leather and wood smoke and something else she couldn't name. Eliza pulled it tighter, guilt and gratitude warring in her chest. They rode in silence for what felt like hours. Maybe it was hours. Time stopped meaning anything when every moment was just survival, just the next breath, the next foot forward. "Why me?" Eliza finally asked. She had to know. "You said you knocked on 3 other doors first." Caleb's hands shifted on the reins. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "Martha Cooper," he said finally. "She said no because her husband won't let her work for a single man. Improper." His tone suggested what he thought about that reasoning. Jenny Mills said no because she's afraid of storms, and Dorothy Price said no because... He stopped. "Because?" Eliza pressed. "Because she doesn't think I can pay." The words came out flat. "Ranch has been struggling. Everyone knows it. She figured I'd work her half to death and then tell her the money's gone." "Will you?" Eliza asked. "Work me half to death?" "Probably." At least he was honest. "But you'll get paid. Every cent I promised." "Why didn't you knock on my door first?" The question hung between them. The wagon lurched through a drift, and Caleb fought to keep it steady before answering. "Didn't think you'd say yes," he admitted. "You've got that bakery job. Figured you were settled, comfortable." Eliza almost laughed. Comfortable. She'd been surviving on stale bread and blind hope for 2 years. "I knocked on your door fourth," Caleb continued, "because you were my last option, and I'm glad the others said no because..." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because you're the one I should have asked first. You're the one I wanted to ask first. Just took me 3 rejections to get brave enough." Something in Eliza's chest did a strange, painful twist. Before she could respond, the wagon lurched sideways, hard. One wheel dropped into something, a hole, a drift. She couldn't tell. And suddenly they were tilting at an angle that screamed danger. Caleb swore, hauling on the reins. The horses screamed. Eliza grabbed for the seat, for anything, her heart in her throat as the world went sideways. A hand locked around her wrist. Iron strong. Caleb's other arm went around her waist, yanking her against him as the wagon tipped further, and then stopped. They hung there, balanced on 2 wheels, the wind shrieking around them. Eliza couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel Caleb's arm tight around her middle, his hand gripping her wrist like he'd die before letting go. "Don't move," he said into her ear. "Don't even breathe hard." The horses were panicking, trying to bolt, which would flip the wagon completely. Caleb made a sound low in his throat, not quite words, something older, and the horses stilled. Still frightened, still trembling, but holding. "I'm going to climb down," Caleb said, his voice absolutely calm in a way that had to be forced. "Going to check the wheel. You stay exactly where you are. Understand?" Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. His arm disappeared from around her waist. The loss of that solid presence made her feel like she might fly apart. She watched, frozen, as Caleb eased himself off the tilted seat and dropped into snow up to his thighs. He disappeared under the wagon. Eliza counted her heartbeats, 20, 30, 40, before he emerged again, his face grim. "Wheel's caught on a buried fence post," he called up. "I can free it, but when I do, the wagon's going to drop hard. You need to jump clear soon as you feel it move." "What about you?" "I'll be fine. Ready?" No. Absolutely not ready. But Eliza shifted her weight, preparing to jump into snow that might be 3 feet deep or might be 6. Caleb moved back under the wagon. There was a creaking sound, a groan of wood and metal, and then the wagon dropped. Eliza threw herself sideways, hit the snow hard enough to knock the air from her lungs, and rolled. Above her, the wagon crashed down onto 4 wheels with a sound like thunder. The horses bolted forward 3 steps before Caleb's voice stopped them again. Eliza lay in the snow, gasping, staring up at a sky that was nothing but white. A face appeared above her. Caleb, snow covering his beard, his hair, his shoulders. He looked like winter itself had come to life. "Hurt?" he asked. Eliza took inventory, bruised, shaken, probably going to feel this tomorrow, but nothing broken. "No," she managed. He reached down. She took his hand and he hauled her upright with enough force that she stumbled against his chest. They stood there for a moment, too close, both breathing hard. "Still want the job?" Caleb asked, and there was something in his voice that might have been humor if the situation weren't so dire. Eliza looked at the wagon, at the blizzard that showed no signs of stopping, at this man who'd wrapped his own coat around her and caught her when she fell. "Yes," she said. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Relief, maybe, or respect. "Then let's go home," he said. The ranch appeared through the storm like a mirage. Buildings materialized slowly, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals barely visible under snow. And then the main house, 2 stories of solid timber and stone that looked like it had been built to withstand the end of the world. Lights burned in several windows. As the wagon pulled close, a door flew open and men spilled out, shouting, reaching for the horses. "Boss, we thought you were dead. Storm's getting worse. Did you find—" "I found someone," Caleb cut through the chaos. He climbed down from the wagon, then turned to help Eliza. His hands circled her waist, lifting her down like she weighed nothing. "This is Miss Boone. She's your new cook. Anyone gives her trouble answers to me personally." The men, cowboys, ranch hands, all of them looking exhausted and desperate, stared at Eliza with expressions ranging from hope to skepticism. "Can she actually cook?" one of them asked. "Can you actually shut up?" Caleb's voice went cold enough to freeze whiskey. "Get her trunk inside. Someone stable the horses. Miss Boone needs to see the kitchen before she decides we're all too stupid to save." They scattered, moving with the kind of obedience that came from healthy fear. Caleb led Eliza toward the house, his hand light on her lower back. A gesture so automatic he probably didn't even notice he was doing it. They climbed steps onto a wide porch, through a door, and into warmth that felt like a physical blow after hours in the cold. The interior of the house was not what Eliza expected. Chaos. Complete chaos. Dirty dishes piled everywhere, laundry scattered across furniture, the smell of burned food and unwashed men in desperation. "Kitchen's through here," Caleb said, sounding embarrassed. It's not great." That was generous. The kitchen looked like a battlefield, every surface covered in grime or dishes or both. The stove, a massive cast iron beast, had grease splattered across its surface thick enough to scrape with a knife. The floor was sticky. The windows were so dirty they barely let in light. Eliza set down her bag and rolled up her sleeves. How many men need feeding? She asked. 15, counting me. Caleb watched her carefully, probably waiting for her to run screaming. They've been eating mostly beans and hardtack for 3 days. A couple of them tried cooking, nearly burned the house down. What food do you have? I'll show you the pantry. The pantry was surprisingly well stocked. Flour, sugar, salt, dried meat, canned goods, potatoes, onions. Someone had planned ahead for winter. The cook who'd abandoned them, probably. Eliza's mind started moving, calculating, planning. Breakfast first. Something hot, filling, fast. I'll need help carrying water, she said, and someone needs to get this stove actually clean before I can use it. I'll do it, Caleb said immediately. She turned to stare at him. You're the ranch owner. And you're the only thing standing between my men and mutiny. I'll haul water, you cook. For the next 2 hours, they worked in a silence broken only by necessity. Caleb carried water, scrubbed the stove with a ferocity that suggested he was taking out frustrations on burnt grease, and hauled out bag after bag of trash. Eliza moved through the chaos with systematic precision, finding tools, organizing workspace, getting a feel for the kitchen's bones beneath the disaster. By 6 a.m., she had biscuits in the oven, gravy bubbling on the stove, and eggs waiting to scramble. The smell of real food began filling the house. Caleb stood near the doorway, his shirt soaked with effort, his face smudged with soot, watching her work. You're good at this, he said quietly. It's just breakfast. No, he shook his head. I mean, you walked into disaster and just started fixing it. No complaints, no panic, you just handled it. Eliza cracked eggs into a pan, not sure how to respond to something that sounded dangerously close to admiration. Someone had to. Most people would have taken one look and demanded I drive them back to town. Most people aren't as desperate as I was. The words came out more honest than she'd intended. Caleb went quiet in a way that felt heavy. Desperate how? He asked finally. Eliza flipped eggs, watching them sizzle, buying time. You ever feel like you're just taking up space? Like you could disappear tomorrow and the world would just rearrange itself around the gap you left? Not even notice? Yes, Caleb said. The single word carried weight. Every day of my life until about 6 hours ago. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an intensity that made her throat tight. What changed 6 hours ago? She asked, though she suspected she knew. You opened your door, he said simply. The moment stretched between them, fragile and strange. Then boots thundered on the stairs. The men, drawn by the smell of food, and reality crashed back in. Breakfast is ready, Eliza said, breaking eye contact. Someone want to set the table? The Cowboys ate like they'd been starving for months instead of days. Eliza watched from the kitchen doorway as platters of biscuits, gravy, eggs, and fried potatoes disappeared so fast she could barely keep them filled. The men's faces, drawn and exhausted when they'd first sat down, gradually relaxed into something resembling human. Ma'am, this is the best thing I've eaten in my entire life, one young hand said around a mouthful of biscuit. That's because you've been eating boot leather for 3 days, Tommy, an older cowboy responded, but he was grinning. But yeah, Miss Boone, this is damn fine cooking. Caleb sat at the head of the table, saying little, but Eliza kept catching him watching her. Not the food, her. Every time she emerged from the kitchen with more coffee or another platter, his eyes tracked her movement like she was something rare he was afraid might vanish. It made her nervous. It made her feel seen. She wasn't sure which feeling was worse. After the men had eaten themselves into stupors and stumbled back to work or rest, Eliza began the overwhelming task of cleaning up. The kitchen had gone from disaster to active war zone. Dishes everywhere, flour-coating surfaces, grease splattered across the stove again. She was elbow-deep in dishwater when Caleb reappeared. You should rest, he said. You've been awake as long as I have. So should you, Eliza countered, but I'm guessing neither of us will. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Probably not. He picked up a towel and started drying dishes without being asked. They worked in silence for a while, falling into an easy rhythm. She washed, he dried, both too tired for unnecessary conversation. Can I ask you something? Caleb said eventually. You're the boss. Don't. His voice was sharp. Don't do that. I'm not asking as your employer. I'm asking as... As someone who's curious, Eliza scrubbed at a stubborn pot, not looking at him. Ask. Why'd you really say yes? And don't tell me it was just the money. She could lie. Should lie, probably. But exhaustion made people honest, and Eliza was bone tired. Because nobody's ever looked at me the way you did, she said quietly. When you asked. Everyone else in that town, I'm invisible. The fat baker lady who makes decent bread and doesn't bother anyone. But you looked at me like I was a person who mattered, like I could do something that mattered. She finally met his eyes. Even if it was just cooking breakfast, it was more than I had. Caleb set down the towel carefully. His jaw worked like he was trying to find words and failing. You're not invisible, he said finally. You're the opposite of invisible. He stopped, frustrated. I'm not good with words. You're doing fine. No, I'm not. He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense. What I'm trying to say is that when you opened your door this morning, the first thing I thought was, thank God. Not because you might say yes, but because you looked at me like I was human. Not a boss or a threat or a source of money. Just a person who needed help. He paused. Turns out we're both starving for the same thing. Just took a blizzard for us to find it. Eliza's hands had stopped moving in the dishwater. Her heart was doing complicated things in her chest. What are we starving for? She asked, barely whispering. Caleb reached out slowly, like she might spook, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with fingers that were surprisingly gentle. Being seen, he said. Actually seen. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm, too full of possibility that terrified her. Eliza pulled her hands from the water, dried them on her apron, and took a deliberate step back. I should finish cleaning, she said, hating how her voice shook. Disappointment flickered across Caleb's face, but he nodded. I'll show you to your cabin. You need proper rest. The cabin turned out to be a small building behind the main house. One room, but clean, with a stove and a real bed, and windows that faced the mountains. Someone had already brought her trunk inside. It's not much, Caleb said, hovering in the doorway like he was afraid to come fully inside. But it's yours. Private. Safe. It's perfect, Eliza said, and meant it. The room she'd had above the bakery had been half this size and cost her a third of her wages. Caleb nodded, but didn't leave. He stood there, snow melting off his boots, looking like he wanted to say something else. Thank you, he said finally, for coming, for staying, for everything. You're paying me $75 a month. That's thanks enough. No, he said quietly. It's not. He left before she could respond, pulling the door closed behind him with a gentleness that somehow felt more intimate than anything else he'd done. Eliza stood in the center of her new home, listening to his footsteps crunch away through snow, and tried to convince herself that the feeling blooming in her chest was simple gratitude. It wasn't, and that terrified her more than the blizzard ever had. The ranch ran on chaos held together by determination and luck. Eliza figured that out within 2 days of arriving. The men worked from before sunrise until well after dark, fighting to keep cattle alive, fix damage from the storm, prepare for worse weather to come. They stumbled in for meals exhausted, desperate, grateful for hot food and a warm kitchen. And slowly, Eliza became the center around which everything else revolved. She learned their names, their preferences, their rhythms. Tommy liked extra sugar in his coffee. Ben, the foreman, had a bad leg that hurt worse in cold weather, so she made sure he got food first. Old Pete couldn't digest beans, so she found alternatives. Marcus had lost his wife 2 years ago and sometimes cried silently in the corner while eating her apple pie because it reminded him of her. She fed them. She listened. She created something that felt almost like family in a place that had been running on survival alone. But it was Caleb who complicated everything. He worked harder than anyone, pushing himself to exhaustion every single day. Eliza would see him from the kitchen windows, out before dawn, and long after dark, moving through tasks with relentless focus. He rarely ate full meals, grabbing food between crises. He slept maybe 4 hours a night. She started leaving coffee ready for him at odd hours, keeping soup warm on the back of the stove for when he finally came in too late for regular meals, making sure there were biscuits wrapped in cloth in the kitchen whenever he needed to grab something before heading back out into the cold. He noticed. You don't have to do this, he said one night, finding her awake at midnight with fresh coffee and leftover stew warming. Do what? Take care of me specifically. He looked uncomfortable. That's not part of the job. Neither is working yourself to death, Eliza countered, but you're doing it anyway. That's different. Why? Caleb didn't have an answer for that. He sat down at the kitchen table with his stew, eating mechanically while Eliza continued cleaning up from dinner. Can I ask you something? She said after a while. Seems only fair since I keep asking you things. Why do you work so hard? The men respect you. The ranch runs well enough. You don't have to be everywhere, doing everything, all the time. Caleb set down his spoon carefully. If I stop moving, I start thinking. About what? About how I built all this? He gestured vaguely at the house, the ranch beyond. And I'm still alone at the end of every day. How I've got 15 men depending on me and no one I can depend on. How I'm 38 years old and the closest thing I have to family is Pete, who works for me. He looked up at her, and the loneliness in his eyes was devastating. So I keep moving. Easier that way. Eliza understood that strategy intimately. She'd spent years using the same approach. Stay busy, stay useful, don't stop long enough to notice the emptiness. You're not alone right now, she said quietly. No, Caleb agreed, his gaze holding hers. I'm not. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Then Caleb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against wood. I should let you sleep, he said. Early, start tomorrow. There's always an early start tomorrow. Something flickered in his expression, amusement maybe, or recognition. True enough. He left through the back door and Eliza watched through the window as he crossed the dark yard toward the main house. Halfway there, he stopped. Stood still in the falling snow, his shoulders rigid, like he was fighting some internal battle. Then he kept walking. Eliza finished cleaning the kitchen, banked the stove, and walked back to her cabin through cold that stole her breath. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Caleb had looked at her. Like she was water and he was dying of thirst. Like she was dangerous. Like she mattered. She fell asleep wondering which of those things scared her most. 2 weeks into her tenure at Ward Ranch, Eliza realized she'd stopped thinking about the bakery in Medicine Ridge. That life, the tiny room, the demanding boss, the endless sameness, had started feeling like something that happened to someone else. This life, with its chaos and exhaustion and strange sense of purpose, felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. The men had accepted her completely. They joked with her, asked her advice about things that had nothing to do with cooking, treated her like she belonged. Tommy had started calling her Mama Eliza, which made her feel approximately 100 years old and also secretly pleased. But it was the small moments that undid her. Like when she found Caleb asleep at the kitchen table one morning, his head pillowed on ranch ledgers, his hand still holding a pencil. He looked younger when he slept, less guarded. Eliza had stood there for a long moment, just watching him breathe, before quietly draping a blanket over his shoulders and leaving him to rest. Or when he'd noticed her struggling to carry firewood to her cabin, and without a word, had chopped and stacked an entire cord outside her door. When she'd tried to thank him, he'd just shrugged and said, "Can't have you freezing," like it was nothing. Or the way he always made sure she ate, even when feeding everyone else. How he'd set aside the best portions for her, or save the last biscuit, or pour her coffee without being asked. They were falling into patterns, rhythms, the kind of unspoken understanding that came from paying attention to another person's needs without announcement. It felt dangerous. It felt like hope. And then Ben got hurt, and everything shifted. The accident happened on a Wednesday. Ben, solid, dependable Ben, who'd been running ranches since before Eliza was born, got thrown from a spooked horse and hit the fence rail wrong. The sound of the impact carried all the way to the kitchen, where Eliza was preparing lunch. She ran outside without thinking, without grabbing a coat, following the shouting to the corral where men clustered around Ben's motionless form. "Move," she said sharply, and the men parted. Ben lay twisted at an angle that made Eliza's stomach lurch. His face was gray, his breathing shallow. Blood soaked through his shirt from somewhere she couldn't immediately see. "Someone get Caleb," she said, kneeling in the snow beside Ben. "Now!" Tommy bolted. Eliza carefully touched Ben's shoulder, the one that didn't look broken, and his eyes fluttered open. "Hey there," she said softly. You're going to be fine. Just stay still. Hurts, Ben managed. I know. Don't move. Help's coming. Caleb appeared within minutes, running full out from wherever he'd been working. He dropped to his knees beside Eliza, his face going tight as he assessed the damage. Ribs, he said grimly. Maybe something internal. We need to get him inside. Moving Ben was a nightmare. He screamed when they lifted him, a sound that would haunt Eliza's dreams for weeks. But they got him into the house, onto a bed in one of the downstairs rooms, and Eliza immediately started doing what she could, cleaning wounds, checking for obvious breaks, trying to keep him warm and stable. Someone needs to ride for the doctor, Caleb said. Doctor's in Cheyenne, old Pete said quietly. 3-day ride in good weather. Then ride, Caleb snapped. Now, Pete left. The other men hovered uselessly until Caleb barked orders that sent them scattering, and then it was just Caleb and Eliza working over Ben's broken body, trying to keep him alive until help could arrive. Eliza had never done anything like this before. She wasn't a doctor, wasn't trained in anything beyond basic first aid, but she'd grown up poor, in a place where doctors were luxury, and she'd learned to handle crises with whatever tools were available. She cleaned wounds, wrapped ribs tightly, made poultices from kitchen ingredients that might help with infection, spooned willow bark tea into Ben whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. Caleb watched her work with something like awe. Where'd you learn this? He asked at one point. Necessity, Eliza said, not looking up from the bandage she was tying. You don't have to be trained to figure out what needs doing. Most people would panic. Panicking doesn't help. She finally met his eyes. Doing something, even if you're not sure it's right, that at least gives you a chance. They worked through the night. Ben's fever spiked and dropped and spiked again. He rambled, semi-conscious, calling for people who weren't there. Twice he stopped breathing long enough that Eliza thought they'd lost him, but each time Caleb managed to get him back. Somewhere around 3 a.m., with Ben finally sleeping somewhat peacefully, Eliza stepped outside for air. The cold hit like a slap, sharp and cleansing. She stood on the porch, shaking, adrenaline finally crashing, and tried not to think about how close they'd come to losing him. The door opened behind her. Caleb stepped out, looking as wrecked as she felt. You should sleep, he said. So should you. Can't. He leaned against the porch railing, staring out at darkness. Keep thinking about how easily that could have been worse. How we're one accident away from disaster, always. How I can't protect everyone no matter how hard I try. Eliza moved to stand beside him. Their shoulders nearly touched. You can't save everyone from everything. That's not how life works. Then what's the point of any of this? The question came out raw. Building this ranch? Working myself to death? What's it for if I can't even keep my people safe? It's for moments like this, Eliza said quietly. When Ben wakes up tomorrow, alive because you got him inside, and I knew enough to keep him stable and Pete's riding through hell to bring help. It's for giving people a place that feels like home even when it's hard. It's for... She stopped, not sure how to finish. For what? Caleb turned to look at her directly. For not being alone, she said. For building something that matters. Even if it's fragile. Even if it's hard. Caleb's hand found hers on the railing. His fingers, rough and warm, laced through hers with careful deliberation. I'm glad you're here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I would have done tonight without you. Probably lost him. Probably lost my mind. Eliza looked down at their joined hands. This was dangerous territory. She was his employee. This was professional suicide. She should pull away, establish boundaries, protect herself from inevitable hurt. She didn't move. I'm glad I'm here too, she said instead. They stood like that for a long time, holding hands in the dark, neither willing to let go or push further. The night stretched around them, cold and vast and surprisingly gentle. Eventually, Caleb's thumb began tracing slow circles on the back of her hand, an absent gesture that made Eliza's breath catch. Can I tell you something? He asked. Yes? I didn't knock on those other doors first because I thought they'd say yes easier, he admitted. I knocked on them because I was afraid of what it would mean if you said yes. Afraid of... He stopped. Afraid of what? Eliza prompted gently. Afraid I'd start needing you, Caleb said bluntly, and I've spent my whole life trying not to need anyone. Safer that way. But then you opened your door and looked at me like I was worth helping, and I thought—" He laughed quietly, without humor. "I thought maybe needing someone wouldn't be the worst thing that ever happened to me." Eliza's throat felt tight. "And now? Now I'm terrified," he said honestly, "because I was right. I do need you, and that gives you power to destroy me." She should say something reassuring, something safe. Instead, she squeezed his hand tighter and told the truth. "I'm terrified too," she said, "because I've spent my whole life being invisible, and you keep seeing me, and I don't know what to do with that except want more of it." Caleb turned to face her fully. In the darkness, his expression was shadowed, but his eyes caught what little light there was. "What if we're both terrified together?" he suggested. "Would that make it easier?" "Probably not," Eliza said. "Probably not," he agreed, but neither of them let go. They stood there until the cold became unbearable, until Ben's condition required checking, until reality demanded they return to their respective roles. But something had shifted between them. Some wall crumbled, some truth acknowledged. As Eliza finally pulled her hand free and moved toward the door, Caleb caught her wrist gently. "Eliza," he said, using her first name for the first time. "Thank you for everything, for being—" He searched for words. "For being you." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and slipped back inside. Ben recovered slowly. The doctor, when he finally arrived 5 days later, said it was a miracle the man had survived at all. Credited Eliza's quick thinking and Caleb's calm under pressure. Said most people would have made crucial mistakes that cost the patient his life. The men treated Eliza differently after that. Not just as their cook, but as someone who'd proven herself when it mattered. Someone worth protecting, worth respecting. But it was the way Caleb looked at her that changed most dramatically. He started finding excuses to be in the kitchen, helping with tasks he'd never touched before, staying late after meals to talk. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, more dangerous. He told her about building the ranch from nothing, about his parents dying young, about years of loneliness masked as independence. She told him about growing up poor, about dreams abandoned, about learning to make herself small enough that disappointment couldn't find her. They were circling something, both knowing it, both afraid to name it. And then winter deepened, the blizzards came harder, and the world shrank to just the ranch, just survival, just each other. The inevitable stopped being something they could avoid. It became something they couldn't help but fall into. The morning Marcus insulted her, Eliza was kneading bread dough and thinking about Caleb's hands. Dangerous thoughts, stupid thoughts, but they kept coming anyway. The memory of his fingers laced through hers on the porch, the careful way he touched her elbow when passing in narrow spaces, how he'd started lingering after meals with coffee he didn't drink, just watching her work like she was something worth studying. She was so lost in those thoughts that she didn't hear Marcus come in until he spoke. "You getting soft on the boss?" Eliza's hand stilled in the dough. Marcus stood in the doorway, his expression ugly in a way she'd never seen before. He'd been drinking. She could smell it from across the room. "Excuse me," she said carefully. "Don't play stupid." Marcus moved closer, unsteady. "Whole ranch sees it, the way he looks at you, the way you look back. You think sleeping your way into ownership is going to work? Think you'll actually marry someone like you?" The words hit like fists. Eliza felt her face go hot, then cold. "Get out of my kitchen," she said quietly. "It's not your kitchen. Nothing here's yours. You're just the help, same as me, except I don't pretend I'm something special just because the boss is desperate enough to—" "That's enough." Caleb's voice cut through the room like a blade. Eliza hadn't heard him come in. Neither had Marcus, who went pale despite the alcohol. Caleb stood in the doorway, his face absolutely still in that way that meant he was furious beyond words. He looked at Marcus like he was deciding between firing him and killing him. "Outside," Caleb said. "Now." Marcus stumbled out. Caleb followed, but paused at the doorway long enough to look back at Eliza. "Are you all right?" he asked. Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. His jaw tightened, and then he was gone. She heard the shouting from outside. Caleb's voice raised in a way she'd never heard before. Marcus trying to defend himself and failing. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then silence. Then the sound of a horse being saddled. When Caleb came back inside, his knuckles were bleeding. "He's gone," Caleb said flatly. "Gave him an hour to pack and get off my property. If he's still here after that, I'll drag him off myself. Eliza stared at the blood on his hand. You hit him. I did. No apology in his voice. And I'll do it again if anyone else talks to you that way. You can't punch every cowboy who doesn't like me. Watch me. Caleb crossed to the sink, running water over his knuckles without flinching. What he said was unacceptable. What he implied was worse. I won't have that on my ranch. Eliza abandoned the bread dough and came to stand beside him. Without asking permission, she took his hand and examined the damage. Split skin across 2 knuckles, already swelling. She pulled clean cloth from a drawer and began wrapping it with hands that shook slightly. He wasn't completely wrong, she said quietly. Caleb's other hand came up to catch her chin, tilting her face toward his. Don't you dare believe a word that drunk fool said. People are talking about us. Let them talk. Easy for you to say. You own the ranch. She stopped, but Caleb finished for her. Just what? Just the woman who saved Ben's life? Just the person who turned this place from chaos into something that works? Just the first thing I think about when I wake up, and the last thing I think about before I sleep? His thumb brushed across her cheek, gentle, despite the anger still tight in his shoulders. You're not just anything, Eliza. The kitchen door banged open. Tommy stood there, looking panicked. Boss, we got trouble at the north fence. Looks like something took down a whole section overnight. Cattle are getting out. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, visibly forcing himself back to ranch owner mode. His hand dropped from Eliza's face. How many head are we missing? He asked. Don't know yet. Ben's doing count now, but it's bad. Caleb nodded once, then looked back at Eliza. We're not done with this conversation. I know, she said. He left, taking Tommy with him, and Eliza stood alone in the kitchen with half-wrapped bread dough and the ghost of his touch still warm on her face. The knockdown fence turned into a 3-day crisis. Cattle scattered across miles of open range had to be rounded up in weather that was trying to kill everyone involved. The men worked themselves into exhaustion, coming back to the ranch only long enough to eat, change horses, and collapse for a few hours of sleep before heading out again. Eliza kept the kitchen running around the clock. Hot food ready at all hours, coffee constantly brewing, a pot of stew always simmering for whenever exhausted cowboys stumbled in looking half dead. She barely slept. Neither did Caleb. She'd catch glimpses of him through windows, riding out before dawn, returning after dark, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Once she saw him literally asleep in the saddle while his horse walked back to the barn. Pete had to wake him up. On the 3rd night, Eliza was cleaning up after a midnight meal when Caleb finally appeared. He looked worse than she'd ever seen him, covered in mud, and worse, soaking wet from crossing a river, shaking with cold. Sit, she ordered, pointing at a chair near the stove. I'm fine. You're hypothermic. Sit down before you fall down. He sat, probably because standing was taking more energy than he had left. Eliza moved fast. She built up the fire in the stove, heated water, poured whiskey into coffee that was more medicine than drink. Then she grabbed blankets and started peeling off his wet coat. I can do it, Caleb protested weakly. You can barely hold the cup I just gave you. Stop being stubborn. He stopped arguing. Let her work his arms out of the soaked coat, unbutton his shirt with fingers made clumsy by the cold. His skin beneath was ice cold, covered in bruises and cuts she hadn't known about. Jesus, Caleb, she whispered, what did you do to yourself? Got the cattle back, he said, his voice slurring slightly with exhaustion. Every single one. Couldn't lose them. Can't afford to lose anything else. Eliza wrapped him in dry blankets, then knelt in front of him to unlace his boots. They were frozen solid, the leather stiff with ice. Getting them off his feet took effort and probably hurt, though Caleb didn't complain. When's the last time you ate? She asked. He had to think about it. That was answer enough. She heated soup while he sat wrapped in blankets, staring at nothing. When she brought him the bowl, his hands shook too badly to hold it steady. Here, Eliza said, pulling up a chair close to his. She took the bowl back and lifted the spoon to his mouth. Caleb stared at her. I'm not an invalid. You're exhausted and hypothermic and about to pass out. Let me help you. For a moment she thought he'd refuse out of sheer pride. Then his shoulders sagged and he let her feed him like a child, too tired to maintain the pretense of being invincible. They sat like that in the quiet kitchen. Her feeding him soup one spoonful at a time, him accepting it with the weary surrender of someone who'd pushed too far for too long. The fire crackled. Outside, wind howled against the windows. "Why do you do this to yourself?" Eliza asked after the bowl was half empty. "Do what?" "Work until you break. Push past every reasonable limit. Act like the whole world will collapse if you stop moving for 5 seconds." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Because it's true. If I stop, things fall apart. Fences break. Cattle die. Men get hurt. The ranch fails and everyone loses everything, and it's my fault for not being strong enough to hold it together. That's not how ranching works. That's not how anything works. It's how my life works." His eyes met hers, and the exhaustion there went deeper than physical. "I've been alone since I was 16 years old, Eliza. Built everything you see from nothing, by myself because there was nobody else to do it. And yeah, now I've got men working for me, but at the end of the day, it's still my problem, my responsibility, my failure if it doesn't work." "It doesn't have to be," she said quietly. "You don't have to carry everything alone anymore." "Don't I?" Something raw flickered in his expression. "What happens when you leave? When winter ends and you decide Medicine Ridge wasn't so bad after all? I'll be right back where I started, except now I'll know what it feels like to have someone actually care whether I come home at night. That's worse than never having it at all." Eliza set down the soup bowl carefully. Her heart was doing painful things in her chest. "Is that what you think?" she asked. "That I'm going to leave?" "Everyone leaves eventually." "Not everyone." She reached out and took his ice-cold hand between both of hers, trying to warm it. "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb, even if you're too stubborn and scared to believe that." He looked at their joined hands like he was trying to solve a complicated equation. "You don't know that. You don't know what you'll want when spring comes." "I know I don't want to be invisible anymore," Eliza said fiercely. "I know I don't want to go back to a life where nobody notices if I'm there or not. And I know that when you almost froze to death tonight, the only thing I could think about was how I'd never forgive myself if I didn't tell you that I—" She stopped, suddenly terrified. "That you what?" Caleb's voice had gone very quiet. This was it. The cliff edge. She could step back, make something up, protect herself from the inevitable pain of wanting something she couldn't have, or she could jump. "That I care about you," Eliza said, the words coming out raw and honest. "More than I should, more than is smart. And I'm terrified because I don't know how to do this, but I'm more terrified of pretending I don't feel it." Caleb stared at her like she'd just told him the sun was blue. "You care about me." "Yes, you idiot. Why?" The question was so genuinely confused that Eliza almost laughed, almost cried. "Because you looked at me like I mattered when everyone else looked through me. Because you wrapped me in your coat during a blizzard. Because you punch cowboys who insult me, and you carry me when I'm tired and you're so desperately lonely, it makes my chest hurt. Because," her voice cracked, "because when I watch you work yourself to death, all I can think is that someone needs to take care of you the way you take care of everyone else." Caleb's free hand came up slowly, carefully, like he thought she might disappear if he moved too fast. His palm cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I don't know how to do this either," he admitted. "Don't know how to need someone without destroying them. Don't know how to love without—" He stopped. "Without what?" Eliza whispered. "Without losing them," he finished quietly. "I've lost everyone I ever loved. Parents, friends, even my brother in a way that's worse than death. Everyone leaves or dies or decides I'm not worth the trouble. So I stopped trying, safer that way. Life isn't about being safe." Says the woman who spent years hiding in a bakery. He had her there. Eliza managed a watery laugh. "Maybe we're both cowards." "Maybe," Caleb agreed. His hand was still on her face, and he was looking at her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. "Or maybe we're just two people who've been hurt enough that being brave feels impossible. Is that what this is? Being brave?" "Terrifying and brave," he said. "Same thing sometimes." The kitchen had gone very quiet around them. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Wyoming night, but in this small, warm space, the rest of the world felt very far away. "I'm going to kiss you," Caleb said, the words more question than statement. "If that's something you want." Want didn't even begin to cover it. Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. His lips touched hers gentle, uncertain, like he was afraid of breaking something precious. The kiss was careful and sweet and somehow heartbreaking in its tenderness. Eliza made a small sound in her throat and leaned into it, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders through the blanket. Caleb's hand slid from her cheek into her hair, and the kiss deepened, went from tentative to desperate in the space of a heartbeat. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "That was," he started. "Yeah," Eliza agreed, because words were impossible right now. They sat like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, trying to remember how breathing worked. Then Caleb started laughing, quiet, surprised laughter that shook his shoulders. "What?" Eliza asked. "I just spent 3 days in hell chasing cattle, nearly died crossing a frozen river, and the best part of all of it was coming back to you." He pulled back enough to look at her properly, and his eyes were warm despite the exhaustion. "How is that possible?" "I don't know," Eliza said honestly, "but I spent those same 3 days terrified you wouldn't come back, so I guess we're both losing our minds." "Probably." Caleb stood, pulling her up with him, keeping her close. "Come here." He wrapped her in his blanket with him, and they stood together by the stove's warmth, his arms around her waist, her head tucked under his chin, both of them shaking slightly for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. "Stay tonight," Eliza said before she could think better of it. "Just stay. You're too exhausted to walk back to the house anyway." She felt him tense. "Eliza, I'm not asking for anything except sleep," she said quickly, "but you're dead on your feet and my cabin's closer and warmer, and I—" She stopped, embarrassed. "You what?" "I don't want you to leave yet," she admitted quietly. "Is that selfish?" Caleb's arms tightened around her. "No, it's the opposite of selfish. He took a shaky breath. "It's the best thing anyone's offered me in longer than I can remember." They walked to her cabin through snow that had started falling again, Caleb leaning on her more than he probably wanted to admit. Inside, Eliza built up the fire while he collapsed onto the bed, still wrapped in blankets. "I'm getting your bed dirty," he mumbled, already half asleep. "I don't care." She pulled off his remaining wet clothes with clinical efficiency, replacing them with dry shirts from her own trunk. He was too exhausted to be embarrassed. When she finally climbed in beside him, staying carefully on her side of the mattress, Caleb's arm snaked around her waist and pulled her against his chest. "This all right?" he asked, his voice already slurring with sleep. "Yes," Eliza whispered. He was asleep within seconds, his breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of complete exhaustion. Eliza lay awake longer, feeling the solid warmth of him against her back, his arm heavy around her waist, and tried to remember the last time she'd felt this safe. She couldn't. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, wrapped in Caleb's arms, Eliza finally let herself believe that maybe, this was real. That maybe she'd found something worth the risk of being seen. She fell asleep still thinking it, and didn't wake until dawn. When Eliza opened her eyes, Caleb was already awake, propped on one elbow, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning." She was suddenly very aware of how close they were, how intimate this was. "How do you feel?" "Like I got kicked by a horse, but better than last night." His hand came up to brush hair from her face. "Thank you for taking care of me, for—" He gestured vaguely at the bed, at them. "For this." "You don't have to thank me for basic human decency." "I do when I'm not used to receiving it." His thumb traced along her cheekbone, gentle and reverent. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "What are we doing?" The question was vulnerable, uncertain. Us. What is this? Eliza considered lying, protecting herself, keeping things vague and deniable. Then she remembered the feeling of his arms around her in the dark and decided she was done being careful. "I don't know what we're doing," she said honestly, "but I know I want to keep doing it. Does that make sense?" Relief flooded Caleb's expression. "Yes. More sense than anything else in my life right now." "Good." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at her. "What about the men? Marcus wasn't wrong that people will talk." Caleb's expression hardened. "Let them talk. I don't care what anyone thinks except you. That's easy to say when you're the boss. You think this is easy for me? He sat up, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Eliza, I've spent 15 years building this ranch into something that works. My reputation is the only thing keeping it solvent. If word gets out that I'm... He stopped. That you're what? Sleeping with the help? The words came out bitter. That I'm courting you, Caleb corrected sharply. That I'm serious about you in a way that means I want you here permanently, not just until spring. That means marriage eventually if you'll have me, which I know is insane to even think about right now. But I don't do things halfway, Eliza. I don't know how. The air left Eliza's lungs. Marriage. Eventually, Caleb said quickly, I'm not proposing right now. I know it's too soon, too fast, too... He looked genuinely panicked. I shouldn't have said anything. No. Eliza sat up, taking his face between her hands, forcing him to look at her. No, don't take it back. I need to know you're serious, that this isn't just loneliness or convenience, or... It's not. Caleb's hands covered hers, pressing them tighter against his face, like he needed the anchor. I don't know what it is exactly, but I know it's not that. I know that when Marcus said those things about you, I wanted to kill him. I know that watching you sleep last night felt more like home than this ranch has ever felt. I know I'm probably doing this all wrong, but I'm trying to be honest about what I want. What do you want? Eliza asked. You, he said simply. Here, permanently, as my partner in every sense of the word. Not my employee or my convenience or my secret, my equal, my... He struggled for words. The person I build a life with instead of just surviving alone. Eliza kissed him. Hard, desperate, trying to communicate everything she couldn't find words for. Caleb made a surprised sound, then kissed her back with equal intensity, his hands sliding into her hair, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb's eyes had gone dark. That's a yes? He asked. That's a, I want the same thing, but I'm terrified, Eliza clarified. That's a, we're both probably crazy, but I don't care. That's a yes. Caleb laughed, actually laughed, the sound surprised and delighted. Then he kissed her again, slower this time, thorough and claiming and full of promise. They were still tangled together when someone pounded on the cabin door. Boss! Tommy's voice, urgent. Boss, you in there? We got another problem. Caleb pulled back with a groan. Of course we do. You should go, Eliza said, even though she wanted to keep him there forever. I should. But he didn't move, just looked at her with an expression that made her chest ache. Tonight. Can I come back tonight? Talk more about this? Yes. Good. One more quick kiss, then he was pulling on boots, grabbing his coat, transforming back into the ranch owner who carried everything alone. Except now, he didn't have to. He paused at the door, looking back. Eliza? Yeah? I meant it, all of it. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with her racing heart and the impossible knowledge that she'd somehow found exactly what she'd stopped believing existed. The day passed in a blur of normal ranch routine that felt anything but normal. Eliza cooked and cleaned and managed the kitchen like always, but everything felt different now. Brighter, more possible. The men must have noticed something. She caught Pete watching her with knowing eyes, and Tommy grinning for no apparent reason. But nobody said anything direct, until Ben cornered her in the pantry that afternoon. So, he said casually, examining a sack of flour with intense concentration. Boss seems in a better mood today. Does he? Eliza tried to sound neutral. Yep, almost smiled at breakfast. Nearly gave me a heart attack. Ben finally looked at her directly. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Eliza felt heat crawl up her neck. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Ben's expression softened. Look, I'm going to say this once and then mind my own business. Caleb Ward's been alone too long. He's a good man who's forgotten how to be anything except a boss. If you're the person who reminds him he's human, well, he shrugged. Ranch could use more of that. We all could. Ben, I'm not asking for details, he cut her off gently. Just saying, whatever's happening, it's making him better. Making the whole place better. So don't let anyone make you feel bad about it. He patted her shoulder awkwardly and left. Eliza stood alone in the pantry, blinking back unexpected tears. That night, after the men had eaten and dispersed, Caleb appeared in the kitchen as promised. He looked nervous, actually nervous, this man who faced down storms and crisis without flinching. "Hi," he said. "Hi," Eliza echoed. They stared at each other for a moment, suddenly awkward now that the crisis and exhaustion weren't there to push them together. "Want a walk?" Caleb offered. "It's clear out. Stars are nice." They bundled up and stepped into cold that stole breath but was bearable without wind. The sky was so full of stars it looked artificial, like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. They walked in silence at first, their boots crunching through snow, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Caleb's hand found hers, and they walked like that, holding hands like nervous teenagers, neither quite sure what came next. "I've been thinking," Caleb said eventually. "Dangerous activity." He huffed a laugh. "Probably. But I need to say this while I've got the courage." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "This morning, when I said marriage, I meant it. Not right now, not tomorrow, but I need you to know that's where my head is, where my heart is. If that's not what you want, if this is just—" "It's not just anything," Eliza interrupted. "I've spent my whole life being temporary. Temporary jobs, temporary rooms, temporary everything. I don't want temporary anymore, Caleb. I want permanent. I want roots. I want—" She took a shaky breath. "I want you, however that looks, whatever that means." Caleb's hands came up to frame her face. "It means I'm going to court you properly. No hiding, no pretending this is just employer and employee. It means when spring comes and the circuit preacher makes his rounds, I'm going to ask you to marry me in front of everyone. And it means until then, we figure this out together." "People will talk," Eliza warned. "Let them." Caleb leaned down, resting his forehead against hers. "I've spent too long caring what people think. I'm done with that. I care what you think. That's all that matters anymore." Eliza's hands fisted in his coat, holding him close. "I think you're the bravest person I've ever met, and the most stubborn, and possibly the most wonderful." "Possibly?" He was smiling. "Definitely," she corrected. "Definitely the most wonderful." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, under a sky full of stars. And Eliza thought that if her life had to change completely to get to this moment, it was worth every terrifying second. When they finally walked back to her cabin, together, openly, not caring who might see, Caleb paused at her door. "Can I stay again?" he asked. "Just to sleep. I don't want to— we should wait until—" "Yes," Eliza said, saving him from the awkward explanation. "Stay. Just stay." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and if anyone on the ranch noticed the boss didn't return to the main house that night, nobody was stupid enough to comment. Winter deepened, and with it, their relationship grew in small daily increments. Caleb still worked brutal hours, but now he came home to Eliza instead of empty rooms. They ate together, talked together, slowly built something that felt permanent. The men adjusted faster than Eliza expected. Maybe because Caleb was happier, easier, more patient. Maybe because Eliza had proven herself enough times that they respected her regardless. Maybe because love made both of them better at their jobs. Whatever the reason, the ranch settled into a new rhythm, one that included Caleb and Eliza as a unit rather than separate pieces. And then Catherine Harper arrived, and everything got complicated again. The carriage that pulled up to Ward Ranch on a crisp February morning was the kind that announced money before anyone even stepped out. Black lacquer polished to a mirror shine, brass fittings that caught the sun, horses so well groomed they looked like they'd been brushed with silk. Eliza was rolling out pie dough when she heard the commotion outside. Men's voices raised in surprise, the sound of boots hurrying across frozen ground. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window. A woman descended from the carriage with the kind of grace that came from years of practice. She was beautiful in a way that made Eliza's stomach clench, slender, elegant, dressed in traveling clothes that probably cost more than Eliza earned in 6 months. Dark hair swept up beneath a hat with actual feathers, skin like porcelain. The kind of woman who made rooms go quiet when she entered. And Caleb was walking toward her with an expression Eliza had never seen on his face before. Something between shock and panic. The woman smiled. Even from this distance, Eliza could see it was the kind of smile that knew its own power. Caleb Ward, the woman said, her voice carrying clear across the yard. I thought I'd never find this place. Honestly, you've buried yourself even deeper in the wilderness than I expected. Caleb stopped a few feet away from her, his posture rigid. Catherine, what are you doing here? Catherine. The name hit Eliza like cold water. She'd heard it exactly once, 3 weeks ago, when Caleb had been half asleep and talking about his past. An old friend, he'd said, someone from before the ranch. He'd changed the subject quickly enough that Eliza had known not to push. Now she was here, in the flesh, looking at Caleb like he was something she'd misplaced and finally found again. Can't an old friend visit? Catherine asked, tilting her head in a way that was probably meant to be charming. It's been what, 5 years? 6? I lost track. 7, Caleb said flatly. What do you want, Catherine? Such hospitality. Catherine laughed, but it sounded forced. I've traveled for 2 days to see you. The least you could do is invite me inside before I freeze to death. Caleb hesitated just long enough for Eliza to notice, then nodded. Fine, but you can't stay long. We're in the middle of... Oh, I'm staying at least a few days, Catherine interrupted smoothly. My driver needs rest, the horses need rest, and frankly, so do I. Surely you have a guest room in that enormous house. Eliza watched Caleb's jaw tighten, watched him glance toward the kitchen window, toward her, with something that looked like apology. Then Catherine followed his gaze, and her expression sharpened. Who's that? She asked, staring directly at Eliza through the glass. My cook, Caleb said shortly. Come on, I'll show you inside. My cook, not my partner, not the woman I'm courting, just the cook. Eliza stepped back from the window, her hands shaking slightly, and returned to her pie dough with more force than necessary. She told herself it didn't matter, that Caleb was just being careful, protecting her from gossip, keeping things professional in front of strangers. But the words still stung like a slap. My cook. The kitchen door opened an hour later. Eliza had been expecting Caleb. Instead, Catherine Harper stood in the doorway, looking around the kitchen with the kind of expression people reserved for visiting museums or slums. Polite interest, masking judgment. So you're the famous cook, Catherine said, moving into the room without invitation. Caleb's been singing your praises. Apparently you've transformed this place. I just make the meals, Eliza said carefully, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. Just the meals. Catherine laughed. How modest, though I suppose that's wise. Modesty suits some people better than others. The words were pleasant on the surface, but the tone underneath was pure poison. Eliza's knife paused mid-chop. Can I help you with something, Miss Harper? She asked. Mrs. Harper, actually, though I'm widowed now. Catherine examined her gloves with elaborate care. And no, I'm just curious. Caleb spoke so highly of you that I wanted to see for myself what kind of woman would bury herself on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. The kind who needs work, Eliza said bluntly. Ah, yes. I suppose that makes sense. Catherine's eyes traveled over Eliza in a way that made her feel weighed and found wanting. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone younger, prettier. Catherine smiled sweetly. No offense, of course. I'm sure you're very competent. Eliza set down her knife before she did something she'd regret. If you're looking for Caleb, he's probably in the barn. I'm not looking for Caleb, not yet. Catherine moved closer, her perfume, something expensive and floral, filling the kitchen. I wanted to talk to you first, woman to woman. About what? About Caleb. Catherine's voice dropped to something more intimate, more genuine. I've known him since we were children. Our families were friends. We were... She paused delicately. Well, close, once, before he decided to throw away everything for this ranch. Eliza's stomach was doing uncomfortable things. That's his choice. Is it? Or is it just stubbornness masquerading as independence? Catherine sighed. Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I care about him, and I'm worried about what I'm seeing. What are you seeing? A man isolating himself from everyone who actually understands him, surrounding himself with... Catherine gestured vaguely at the ranch beyond the windows, with cowboys and cattle instead of peers, instead of people from his own world. Maybe this is his world now, Eliza said quietly. Or maybe he's punishing himself for something that wasn't his fault. Catherine's expression shifted to something that might have been genuine concern. Did he tell you what happened? Why he left? That's between him and me. So he didn't tell you? Catherine's smile returned, sharper now. Interesting. What else hasn't he told you, I wonder? Before Eliza could respond, the kitchen door opened again. Caleb stood there, his expression dark. Catherine, he said, his voice cold enough to freeze whiskey. Leave her alone. I'm just getting acquainted with your staff, Catherine said innocently. She's not staff, she's... Caleb stopped, seeming to realize he didn't know how to finish that sentence in front of Catherine. The pause lasted just long enough to hurt. She's what? Catherine prompted sweetly. None of your business, Caleb said flatly. Eliza, can you give us a minute? Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice, and escaped through the back door into cold that felt cleaner than the poisoned air inside. She stood on the porch, breathing hard, trying not to cry from sheer frustration and hurt. Behind her, through the door, she could hear raised voices, Caleb and Catherine arguing about something, though the words were muffled. You all right, Miss Eliza? Tommy had appeared from around the corner, his young face concerned. Fine, Eliza lied. That lady who showed up, she seems like trouble. She's an old friend of Caleb's. Yeah, well, Tommy kicked at the snow. Old friends don't usually make the boss look like he wants to punch something. Just saying. Eliza managed a weak smile. Go on, get back to work before Ben yells at you. Tommy left reluctantly. Eliza stayed on the porch, watching her breath form clouds in the frozen air, and tried to ignore the sick feeling in her gut that said everything was about to fall apart. That night, Caleb didn't come to her cabin. Eliza waited, sitting by the fire, telling herself there were perfectly good reasons. He was busy with his guest. He was being discreet. He was respecting propriety. But none of those reasons explained why he'd hesitated when Catherine asked what Eliza was to him. She finally went to bed alone and slept badly, and woke up feeling like she'd lost something she never quite had permission to keep. The next 3 days were torture. Catherine seemed to be everywhere Eliza looked, sitting with Caleb at meals, walking with him around the ranch, monopolizing his attention with stories about people Eliza didn't know and a life she'd never been part of. The men were polite to Catherine, but distant, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. She treated them like servants, which they were not, and it showed. But what bothered Eliza most was watching Caleb around Catherine. He was different, stiffer, more formal, like he was wearing a mask of the person he used to be. And he barely looked at Eliza anymore. Oh, he was polite, professional. He thanked her for meals and complimented the food, but the warmth was gone, the connection. The moments when their eyes would meet across a room and entire conversations would happen without words. Now when Eliza looked at him, he looked away. She told herself not to be jealous, told herself she was being irrational. Catherine was just a visitor, an old friend, someone from Caleb's past who would leave soon and everything would go back to normal. But the sick feeling in her stomach wouldn't go away. On the fourth night, Eliza was cleaning the kitchen after a dinner where she'd had to watch Catherine and Caleb laugh together over some shared memory when Ben appeared in the doorway. You look like you want to stab something, he observed. I'm fine. You're a terrible liar. Ben came in, poured himself coffee without asking, and sat at the table. Want to talk about it? Not really. Too bad. I'm old and nosy. He took a sip of coffee, watching her scrub a already clean pot with unnecessary violence. That Catherine woman's got you twisted up. I don't know what you mean. Sure you don't. Ben sighed. Look, I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to listen. Caleb Ward's been alone a long time, long enough that he forgot how to be with people who ain't employees or cattle. Then you showed up and reminded him he's human. That terrified him, and he ran straight toward it anyway because he's not stupid. Eliza set down the pot. What's your point? My point is that woman out there. She's from a world he left behind, a world that told him who he should be, what he should want, how he should live. And he hated it enough to walk away from everything to escape it. Ben met her eyes. But that doesn't mean it's easy for him to face down that world when it shows up on his doorstep, especially when it's wearing a pretty face and reminding him of who he used to be. So what am I supposed to do? Eliza asked, hating how her voice shook. Just wait? Hope he remembers I exist? You're supposed to fight, Ben said simply. You think that Catherine woman's going to just leave without trying to take him back? She came here for a reason, Eliza, and it ain't to reminisce. He barely looks at me anymore. Because he's scared, Ben said. Scared of what she represents, scared of choosing wrong, scared that if he chooses you, he's giving up something he's supposed to want. He stood up, setting down his cup. But you know what? He already chose. He chose weeks ago when he started sleeping in your cabin. He's just forgotten that in the face of everything this woman's stirring up, your job is to remind him. I don't know how. Yes, you do, Ben said. You remind him by being exactly who you are. The woman who saw him when he was drowning and threw him a rope. The woman who makes this place feel like home instead of just work. The woman he can't stop thinking about even when he's trying real hard to. He headed for the door, then paused. And if that don't work, you could always just tell him you love him. Sometimes the direct approach is best. He left before Eliza could respond. Love. She hadn't let herself think that word yet. Hadn't let herself feel it fully, because feeling it meant risking everything. But standing alone in the kitchen, she couldn't deny it anymore. She loved Caleb Ward, loved his strength and his gentleness, and his terrible inability to ask for help. Loved the way he looked at her like she was worth something. Loved the sound of his laugh and the weight of his arm around her waist, and the way he made her feel seen after a lifetime of being invisible. And she was about to lose him without ever telling him. Eliza dried her hands, took off her apron, and went to find him. She found Caleb in the barn, brushing down his horse with mechanical precision. He didn't look up when she approached, though she knew he'd heard her. We need to talk, Eliza said. Not a good time. I don't care. She moved closer, forcing him to acknowledge her presence. Caleb, look at me. He finally did, and the misery in his eyes made her breath catch. What do you want me to say? He asked roughly. I want you to tell me what's happening. Why you've been avoiding me for 4 days. Why you can barely look at me when she's around. Why you called me your cook like I'm just another employee who... Because that's safer. The words burst out of him, sharp and pained. Because if I acknowledge what you actually are to me in front of her, then I have to defend it. I have to explain it. I have to... He stopped, his hands gripping the brush so tight his knuckles went white. You have to what? Eliza pushed. I have to admit I chose this. Caleb set down the brush carefully like it might break. Chose you. Chose this life. And that means admitting I'm never going back to who I was before. Never going to be the man my family wanted. Never going to... His voice cracked. Never going to be enough for people like her. People like her, Eliza repeated. You mean rich, educated, from your world. Yes. And I'm not any of those things. No. Caleb finally looked at her directly. You're better than all of those things. You're real. You're honest. You don't want me for my money or my name or what I can do for you. You just... He stopped. I just what? You just see me, Caleb said quietly. The actual me. Not the ranch owner or the legacy or the potential. Just the man who's tired and lonely and barely holding it together most days. And that terrifies me, Eliza, because people who see you that clearly can destroy you that completely. Eliza moved closer, close enough to touch him. Is that what you think I'm going to do? Destroy you? No. But Catherine might. He looked away again. She's made it very clear why she's here. She wants me back. Back in her world, back in society, back to being who I was before I came here. She's got it all planned out. How I could sell the ranch, move to Cheyenne, use my family connections to build something appropriate. How we could... He stopped. How you could what? Eliza's voice had gone very quiet. How we could be together. How it would be a good match. How people would expect it. Caleb's hands fisted at his sides. She's offering me everything I walked away from 7 years ago. Everything I thought I wanted once. And do you want it? Eliza forced the question out even though she was terrified of the answer. I don't know. The confession came out anguished. I've spent 7 years telling myself I made the right choice leaving that world behind. That building this ranch was worth everything I gave up, and now she's here offering it all back, and I... He looked at Eliza with eyes full of confusion and pain. I don't know what I want anymore. The words hit like a physical blow. Eliza took a step back, her chest tight. That's not true, she said quietly. What? You know exactly what you want. You're just afraid to choose it. Eliza's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. Catherine represents safety, a approval. A life where you don't have to wonder if you made the right choice because everyone else has already decided for you. But that's not what you want, Caleb. That's what you think you're supposed to want. And what do I actually want? He asked, his voice rough. Me, Eliza said simply. This ranch, this light, the one you built yourself instead of inheriting. The one where you're judged on who you are instead of where you come from. The one where, her voice broke. The one where someone loves you for exactly who you are, not who you could be molded into. Caleb stared at her. You love me? Of course I love you, you idiot. Tears were streaming down Eliza's face now, but she didn't care. I've loved you since you knocked on my door in a blizzard looking like death and still made sure I was warm enough. I love you even though you work too hard and won't ask for help and apparently can't make a decision without spiraling into crisis. I love you even though you're standing here breaking my heart because you're too scared to choose something real over something comfortable. Eliza. No, let me finish. She wiped angrily at her tears. Catherine's beautiful and elegant and from your world and probably perfect on paper. And I'm none of those things. I'm heavy and plain and I burn bread sometimes and I'll never be someone people expect you to choose. But I see you, Caleb. I see you when you're exhausted and scared and trying so hard to hold everything together. I see you when you're gentle with the horses and patient with the men and secretly kind when you think nobody's watching. I see all of you, and I love all of you. And if that's not enough, her voice finally broke completely. If that's not enough, then I'll leave. I'll go back to Medicine Ridge and you can have your perfect life with your perfect woman, and you'll never have to worry about disappointing anyone ever again. The silence that followed was devastating. Caleb stood frozen, his face working through emotions too complex to name. Eliza waited, her heart hammering, terrified and brave and already planning how she'd pack her trunk tomorrow. Then Caleb moved. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides and grabbed her face between both hands and kissed her like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning. The kiss was desperate, claiming, full of everything he couldn't say. Eliza made a sound that might have been relief or pain or both, and kissed him back with equal desperation, her hands fisting in his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I'm sorry, he said, his voice wrecked. I'm so sorry. I've been an idiot. Yes, Eliza agreed, still crying. I don't want her. I don't want that life. He pulled back enough to look at her properly. I want you. Just you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and come home to you every night and build something real together. He laughed, shaky and surprised. I want everything, with you, only you. Then why have you been avoiding me? Because I'm a coward, Caleb said bluntly. Because Catherine showing up made me remember everything I walked away from, and for a few days I let myself wonder if I'd made a mistake, if I should have stayed in that world, if I was being selfish, choosing what I want over what I'm supposed to want. He cupped her face gently, wiping away tears with his thumbs. But you know what I realized? What? That I've never been happier than I've been these past 2 months. Never felt more myself. Never felt more like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. And that's because of you. You didn't make me into someone different. You made me into the best version of who I already was. And I'd be the biggest fool alive to give that up for anything. Eliza's chest felt too tight to breathe. You mean it? I mean it. Caleb kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her nose, like he was memorizing her face. I love you, Eliza Boone. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make burnt biscuits and pretend you don't. I love how you see through my walls and refuse to let me hide. He stopped, overwhelmed. I love everything about you, and I'm done being scared of that. What about Catherine's? Catherine leaves tomorrow, Caleb said firmly. I'm telling her tonight that there's no future for us, that there never was, that I'm committed to someone else, and that's not changing. She's not going to take that well. I don't care. Caleb pulled Eliza closer, wrapping his arms around her waist. I'm done caring what people like her think. I'm done trying to be someone I'm not. He took a shaky breath. I'm done being afraid of being happy. Eliza buried her face in his chest, letting herself cry properly now. From relief, from joy, from the sheer terror of almost losing this and getting it back. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet barn while horses shuffled and the ranch settled into evening around them. Finally, Caleb pulled back enough to look at her. "I need to go talk to Catherine. Will you wait for me?" "Where would I go?" Eliza asked. "Nowhere. You're not going anywhere ever again if I have any say in it." He kissed her once more, quick and fierce. "This is going to be ugly. She's not going to leave quietly." "I know. And the men are going to hear everything." "I know. And by tomorrow morning, everyone within 50 miles is going to know that Caleb Ward chose his cook over a wealthy widow from Cheyenne society." "Good," Eliza said firmly. "Let them know. I'm tired of hiding." Caleb's expression shifted into something that might have been awe. "How did I get this lucky?" "You knocked on my door during a blizzard," Eliza said. "Everything else was just two desperate people recognizing each other." He kissed her one more time, then headed toward the house with the grim determination of someone walking into battle. Eliza stayed in the barn, her heart still racing, and tried to believe that this was real, that she'd actually fought for something and won, that love was sometimes as simple as being brave enough to say it out loud. The shouting started 20 minutes later. Eliza could hear it from her cabin, Catherine's voice raised in fury, Caleb staying frustratingly calm. The words were muffled by distance and walls, but the tone was unmistakable. Catherine was not taking rejection well. The argument lasted nearly an hour. Eliza paced her small cabin, alternating between worry and guilt and fierce pride that Caleb was actually doing this, that he'd chosen her, that he was willing to face down his past for their future. Finally, silence. Then a knock on her door. Eliza opened it to find Caleb standing there looking exhausted but lighter, somehow, like he'd been carrying a weight for years and had finally set it down. "It's done," he said. "How bad was it?" "Bad." Caleb came inside, closing the door behind him. "She said a lot of things I'm not going to repeat. Called me a fool, called you worse, threatened to tell everyone back in Cheyenne that I've lost my mind. And I told her I don't care what anyone in Cheyenne thinks because I'm never going back there, that I'm marrying you as soon as the circuit preacher comes through, that she needs to be gone by dawn tomorrow, or I'll have Ben escort her off the property personally." He sat down heavily on the bed. Then she cried, which was somehow worse than the yelling. Eliza sat beside him, taking his hand. "Do you feel bad? About hurting her?" "Yes." "About my choice?" He turned to look at her directly. "No, not even a little bit. She loved you. She loved who she thought I could become. That's not the same thing." Caleb squeezed her hand. "You love who I actually am. That's worth more than anything she was offering." They sat in silence for a moment, processing the enormity of what had just happened. "The men all heard," Caleb said eventually. "Pete was lurking in the hallway like a vulture. By breakfast tomorrow, everyone's going to know." "Good," Eliza said again. "You keep saying that." "Because I mean it." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I spent my whole life being a secret. The kid nobody wanted to claim, the woman nobody wanted to see. I'm done being hidden, Caleb. If loving you means being visible, then I'm visible. And anyone who doesn't like it can leave." Caleb's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her closer. "When did you get so brave?" "About 30 seconds before I told you I loved you," Eliza admitted. "I was terrified." "You didn't look terrified. You looked like you were ready to fight the entire world." "I was. For you." She tilted her head to look up at him. "For us." Caleb kissed the top of her head, and Eliza felt something in her chest settle. Whatever came next, gossip, judgment, Catherine's revenge, they'd face it together. That night, wrapped in Caleb's arms, Eliza fell asleep thinking that being brave was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure, and that she'd do it again in a heartbeat. Catherine left before dawn without saying goodbye to anyone except her driver. Eliza watched from the kitchen window as the fancy carriage pulled away, taking with it the last piece of Caleb's old life. When Caleb came in for breakfast an hour later, the entire crew was already seated and waiting. The room went quiet as he entered, all eyes on him with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. Caleb stood at the head of the table and looked at each man in turn. "I'm sure you all heard the commotion last night," he said bluntly, "so I'm only going to say this once. Eliza and I are together. We're getting married when the preacher comes through. If anyone has a problem with that, Speak now, or keep it to yourself forever. Silence. Then old Pete raised his coffee cup. About damn time, boss. The rest of the men erupted in agreement, some laughing, some clapping Caleb on the back, Tommy whooping loud enough to be heard in the next county. Ben caught Eliza's eye from across the room and nodded once, satisfied. And just like that, it was done. No more hiding, no more pretending, just the truth, laid out plain for everyone to see. Caleb came to stand beside Eliza at the stove, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that was becoming familiar. You all right? He asked quietly. Better than all right, Eliza said, and meant it. They served breakfast together while the men ate and joked and gradually returned to normal ranch routine. And if Caleb kissed her in full view of everyone before heading out to work, well, nobody seemed surprised. The sickness came with the thaw. March arrived early that year, bringing warmer winds that melted snow and turned the ranch roads to mud. Everyone welcomed it at first. Winter had been brutal, and the promise of spring felt like salvation. But the warmth brought something else with it, something that swept through the bunkhouse like wildfire. Tommy was the first to fall ill. He stumbled into breakfast looking gray, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Eliza took one look at him and pointed toward a chair. Sit down before you fall down, she said. I'm fine, Tommy protested, but his voice was weak. Just need coffee. He made it 3 steps before his legs gave out. Ben caught him before he hit the floor. Get him to bed, Caleb ordered, already moving. Eliza, what do we need? Water, clean cloths, willow bark, if we have any left. She was already pulling supplies from the pantry, her mind racing through everything she knew about fevers. And someone needs to check the other men. If this is contagious, she didn't need to finish. By noon, 3 more cowboys were down with the same symptoms: burning fever, violent chills, cough that sounded like it was tearing them apart from the inside. By evening, it was 6. Eliza moved through the bunkhouse like a ghost, checking temperatures, forcing water and medicine down throats, changing sweat-soaked bedding. The men were miserable, groaning, delirious, some of them crying for mothers who were hundreds of miles away or already dead. Caleb worked alongside her, his face grim. He carried water, held down men who were too out of their minds with fever to take medicine willingly, helped Eliza when she needed to change sheets on beds where grown men lay helpless as children. How bad is this going to get? He asked quietly, during a rare moment when both stepped outside for air. I don't know. Eliza's hands were shaking from exhaustion. I've seen sickness sweep through before, back when I was young. Sometimes it passes quick, sometimes... She stopped. Sometimes people die, Caleb finished. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the ranch that suddenly felt more fragile than ever. What do we need? Should I ride for a doctor? Doctor's 3 days away and might not come for cowboys anyway. We can't afford to wait. Eliza rubbed her eyes, trying to think through the fog of exhaustion. We need more willow bark, more clean water, someone to keep the kitchen running so the healthy men don't starve. And she looked at Caleb directly. We need you to not get sick. If you go down, the whole ranch falls apart. I'm fine. You look like death. When's the last time you slept? Caleb had to think about it. Yesterday? That's not sleeping. That's passing out. Eliza grabbed his arm. I'm serious, Caleb. You need to rest or you'll be the next one in that bunkhouse burning up with fever. I can't rest when... Yes, you can. Ben's healthy. Pete's healthy. They can manage the ranch for a few hours while you sleep. She softened her voice. Please. I can't do this alone if you get sick too. That got through to him. Caleb nodded reluctantly, and Eliza watched him trudge toward the house with the defeated posture of a man who'd been pushed past his limits. Then she went back inside to continue the endless work of trying to keep people alive. The next 3 days blurred together into one continuous nightmare. More men fell sick, 9 out of 15 eventually, leaving only a skeleton crew to keep the ranch functioning. Eliza barely slept, catching maybe 2 hours here and there when her body simply gave out. She stopped tasting food, stopped noticing the passage of time, existed only in the space between one fevered body and the next. Caleb tried to help, but Eliza forced him to maintain distance, terrified of him catching whatever was ravaging the bunkhouse. He handled the ranch operations, brought supplies, stood in doorways looking helpless and furious that there was nothing more he could do. "How is he?" Caleb asked on the third night, finding Eliza sitting beside Tommy's bed. Tommy had been unconscious for 6 hours, his breathing shallow and labored. He was so young, barely 19, with a mother somewhere in Kansas who still wrote him letters every month. "Not good," Eliza said quietly. "His fever won't break. I've tried everything I know." Caleb moved closer, despite her earlier warnings, crouching beside her chair. "You've done everything you can. It's not enough." Eliza— "He's going to die, Caleb." The words came out flat, exhausted. "I can feel it, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. You don't know that." "Yes, I do." She looked at Tommy's face, so pale, so young, so still. "I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's hanging on by a thread, and that thread's about to break." Caleb's hand found her shoulder, squeezing gently. "Then you sit with him. Make sure he's not alone when it happens. That's all anyone can ask." Eliza nodded, throat too tight for words. Caleb left to check on the other men. Eliza stayed, holding Tommy's hand, whispering that he was brave, that his mother would be proud, that it was all right to let go if he needed to. Tommy died at sunrise. One moment he was breathing, rough and painful, but breathing. The next, he simply stopped. No dramatic final breath, no last words. Just a young man who'd worked hard and laughed easy and would never see another spring. Eliza sat with his body for a long time, crying silently, before finally going to find Caleb. She found him in the barn, repairing tack with mechanical precision. He looked up when she entered, and his face went white. "Tommy?" he asked. Eliza nodded. Caleb's hand stilled on the leather. Then he set it aside carefully, stood, and pulled Eliza into his arms without a word. She collapsed against him, finally letting herself fall apart after 3 days of holding everything together. "I couldn't save him," she sobbed into his chest. "I tried everything, and it wasn't enough." "I know." Caleb's hand stroked her hair, his own voice rough with grief. "I know you did. What am I going to tell his mother?" The truth, that he wasn't alone, that someone who cared about him sat with him at the end, that he died as brave as he lived. Caleb pulled back enough to look at her face. "And that it's not your fault." "How is it not my fault? I was supposed to eat." "You were supposed to what? Work miracles? Cure diseases with kitchen ingredients and sheer force of will?" His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing away tears. "You're not superhuman, Eliza. You're just a woman doing her best in an impossible situation, and you've saved 8 other men who would have died without you. Don't forget that while you're grieving the one you couldn't save." Eliza wanted to argue, to insist that 1 life lost negated 8 lives saved, but she was too exhausted. She just leaned into Caleb's chest and let him hold her while morning light filtered through the barn walls. They buried Tommy that afternoon in the small cemetery on the hill behind the ranch. The healthy men gathered despite the risk, hats in hands, faces grim. Caleb said a few words about duty and courage. Ben added something about Tommy's terrible jokes and how the bunkhouse would be quieter without him. Eliza stood silent, watching dirt fall on a coffin that shouldn't exist yet, and promised herself she'd write to Tommy's mother personally, that someone would tell her the truth, that her boy had died surrounded by people who valued him, even if none of them were family. After the funeral, Eliza went back to the bunkhouse and continued nursing the remaining sick men with renewed desperation. She would not lose another one. She couldn't. Over the next week, slowly, agonizingly, the tide turned. Fevers began breaking. Men who'd been delirious started recognizing faces again. The bunkhouse went from feeling like a morgue to feeling like a hospital. But the work destroyed Eliza. She pushed herself far past any reasonable limit, surviving on almost no sleep, barely eating, existing only to keep the sick men alive. Caleb tried to force her to rest, but she refused. Couldn't rest. If she stopped moving, she'd remember Tommy's face. If she stopped working, she'd have to feel the guilt. So she kept going until her body made the decision for her. She was refilling water buckets when the world started spinning. Eliza gripped the edge of the well, trying to steady herself, but the dizziness only got worse. The last thing she remembered was the ground rushing up to meet her. She woke in her own bed with no memory of how she got there. Caleb sat in a chair beside her, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking in a way that made Eliza's chest hurt. "Caleb?" Her voice came out as a rasp. His head snapped up. His face was wrecked, eyes red, jaw tight, looking like he'd aged 10 years in however long she'd been unconscious. "You're awake," he said, his voice cracking. "Thank Christ, you're awake." "What happened?" "You collapsed. Been unconscious for 14 hours. Caleb moved from the chair to the bed, taking her hand in both of his. "You scared me half to death, Eliza. I thought—" He stopped, unable to finish. "The men are fine. Getting better every day. Ben's handling the nursing now." Caleb's grip on her hand tightened. "You're done. You hear me? No more working yourself into the ground. You rest or I'll tie you to this bed myself." Eliza tried to sit up. Bad idea. The room spun violently, and she fell back against the pillows with a groan. "I told you," Caleb said, but his voice was gentle. "Your body's done, Eliza. You pushed too hard for too long and it finally gave out. Now you rest and let someone else take care of you for once." "I can't just—" "Yes, you can." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. "Please. I've already lost one person this month. I can't lose you too. I won't survive it." The raw fear in his voice stopped her protests. Eliza closed her eyes and let herself sink into the pillows. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Caleb stayed beside her bed for the next 2 days, leaving only when absolutely necessary. He brought her soup and forced her to eat it, made her drink water even when she insisted she wasn't thirsty, sat in silence when she was too tired to talk, and told her stories about the ranch when she needed distraction. On the 3rd day, Eliza woke to find him asleep in the chair, his head resting on the edge of her bed, his hand still holding hers. She studied his face in the early morning light, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a month ago, the gray in his beard that seemed more prominent, the exhaustion etched into every feature. He'd been carrying so much. The ranch, the sick men, her, all of it on shoulders that were strong but not invincible, and he'd almost broken under the weight. Eliza carefully extracted her hand from his and ran her fingers through his hair. Caleb stirred, his eyes opening slowly. "You should be in a real bed," Eliza said softly. "I'm fine here. You're going to destroy your back sleeping in that chair." "Don't care." Caleb straightened, rolling his shoulders with a wince that proved her point. "How are you feeling?" "Better? Weak, but better." She watched him closely. "How are you?" "I'm—" He stopped, seeming to really consider the question. "I'm tired, Eliza. So tired I can't remember what not being tired feels like. And I'm scared. Scared of what would have happened if you hadn't woken up. Scared that I'm one more crisis away from losing everything I've built. Scared that—" His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Scared that I'm not strong enough to protect the people I love." "You don't have to be," Eliza said gently. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. You don't have to carry everything alone anymore. We're partners, remember? That means when you're drowning, I help pull you up. And when I'm drowning, you help pull me up. That's how this works." "Except you almost died pulling me up." "No, I almost died because I was too stubborn to ask for help when I needed it." She reached for his hand. "Sound familiar?" Caleb huffed a laugh that might have been a sob. "We're both idiots." "Probably." Eliza squeezed his hand. "But we're idiots together. That has to count for something." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Marry me." Eliza blinked. "What?" "Marry me. Not when the preacher comes through. Not in some theoretical future. As soon as you're strong enough to stand for more than 5 minutes. Caleb's eyes were fierce, desperate. "I almost lost you, Eliza. I sat beside this bed for 2 days thinking you might never wake up, and all I could think about was everything I never said. Everything we never got to do. I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to be careful or patient or sensible. I just want you to be my wife before anything else can go wrong." Eliza stared at him, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. This wasn't romantic. Wasn't the proposal she might have dreamed about as a girl. It was messy and desperate and born from fear as much as love. It was perfect. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Caleb's expression crumpled with relief. He pulled her into his arms, carefully, mindful of her weakness, and held her like she might disappear if he let go. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "I love you too," Eliza whispered back,
even though you're terrible at taking care of yourself and you work too hard and you're going to drive me crazy. I'll try to be less terrible. Don't. I like you terrible. He laughed, actually laughed, the sound surprised and genuine. Then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise.
When they finally pulled apart, Caleb's expression had shifted to something more determined. "I'm finding that preacher," he said. "I don't care if I have to ride to 3 counties. We're getting married before month's end. I can't plan a wedding in a month. Don't need a wedding. Just need you and me and someone to make it legal." Caleb stood, sudden energy replacing exhaustion. "Rest. Get your strength back. I'll handle everything else." He left before Eliza could argue, moving with the purposeful stride of a man on a mission. Eliza lay back against her pillows, exhausted but smiling, and thought that maybe being loved by someone as stubborn as Caleb Ward wasn't such a bad thing after all. The preacher arrived 3 weeks later, a circuit rider named Samuel, who'd been traveling through Wyoming performing marriages, baptisms, and funerals for anyone who needed them. Caleb had tracked him down in a town 40 miles away and convinced him to come to the ranch with a combination of money and sheer force of personality. By then, Eliza had recovered enough to stand for more than 5 minutes at a time. The sick men had all recovered except Tommy. The ranch was limping back toward normal operations. Spring was arriving in earnest, bringing green grass and warmer days and the sense that maybe the worst was finally over. The wedding was planned for a Saturday morning in late March. Eliza woke that day feeling strange, nervous and excited and slightly terrified. She'd never imagined getting married, had given up on that dream years ago, resigned to a life of solitude and work. Now she was putting on the best dress she owned, a simple blue cotton that she'd sewn herself, nothing fancy but clean and pressed, and trying to believe this was real. A knock on the cabin door made her jump. "It's me," Ben's voice called. "Brought you something." Eliza opened the door to find Ben holding a small bouquet of early wildflowers. Nothing elaborate, just whatever was blooming on the hillsides. "Figured you should have flowers," he said gruffly, "even if it's just weeds." "They're beautiful," Eliza said, throat tight. "Thank you." "Boss is pacing like a caged animal out there," Ben added with a hint of amusement. "Keeps asking if you've changed your mind. Tell him I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Ben nodded and left. Eliza took one last look in her small mirror, decided she was as ready as she'd ever be, and stepped outside. The entire crew had gathered in front of the main house, all 14 remaining men, scrubbed clean and wearing their best clothes, looking uncomfortable but pleased. Someone had dragged benches from the bunkhouse to create makeshift seating. Pete had his fiddle, ready to play, and Caleb stood at the front beside the preacher, looking like he might vibrate out of his skin from nerves. He was wearing a suit. Where he'd gotten it, Eliza had no idea, but it fit him well enough. His beard was trimmed, his hair was combed. He looked terrified and hopeful, and so handsome it made her chest ache. When his eyes found hers, his whole face changed. The nervousness melted into something softer, something that looked like wonder. Eliza walked toward him across ground that was still muddy from winter melt, holding her wildflower bouquet, acutely aware that this was the strangest, most imperfect wedding anyone had ever had, and she loved every second of it. When she reached Caleb, he took her hand and held it like a lifeline. "You came," he said stupidly. "Of course I came, idiot. Where else would I be?" He laughed, shaky with relief, and turned toward the preacher. The ceremony was simple. Samuel read from a worn Bible, asked the required questions, pronounced them husband and wife in less than 10 minutes. When Caleb kissed her, the crew erupted in cheers and Pete started playing something vaguely resembling a wedding march on his fiddle. "You're stuck with me now," Caleb whispered against her lips. "Good," Eliza whispered back. "That's exactly where I want to be." They celebrated with a meal Eliza had prepared the day before. Nothing fancy, just good food and better company. The men ate and drank and told increasingly inappropriate stories about ranch life. Someone produced actual whiskey from somewhere. Pete played more music. It wasn't elegant, wasn't what anyone would call a proper wedding celebration. But it was real and warm and full of people who genuinely cared, and that made it more valuable than any society party could have been. As the sun began setting, Caleb pulled Eliza away from the celebration toward the house. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere private." He led her upstairs to the bedroom that had been his alone until today.
I have something for you. From a drawer, he pulled out a small wooden box and handed it to her. Inside was a ring, simple gold, slightly worn, clearly old. It was my mother's, Caleb said quietly. The only thing of hers I kept. I know it's not new or fancy, but
It's perfect, Eliza interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. Help me put it on?
Caleb took the ring with shaking hands and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. They stood there in the fading light, husband and wife, both terrified and certain in equal measure. I don't know how to do this, Caleb admitted. Be married. Be someone's husband. Be... He gestured vaguely at the intimacy of the moment.
Neither do I, Eliza said.
But we'll figure it out together. That's what we do, right? Figure things out together. Together, Caleb agreed. He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. I promise I'll be better at this than I am at everything else. You're already better than you think. I nearly lost you last month. But you didn't. I'm right here. Eliza pulled back to look at him. We survived winter. We survived sickness. We survived Catherine and gossip and your own stubborn fear. We're going to survive this too. Caleb's hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. How did I get this lucky? You knocked on the right door during a blizzard, Eliza said. Everything else was just two people brave enough to say yes. He kissed her then, slow and thorough, full of promise and possibility. And when he picked her up and carried her to the bed that was now theirs, Eliza thought that all the loneliness and invisibility and pain of her previous life had been worth it to arrive at this moment. Worth it to find someone who saw her, who chose her, who loved her exactly as she was. Outside, the celebration continued. Inside, two people who'd spent most of their lives alone finally understood what it meant to come home. Marriage didn't make things easier. If anything, it made them harder. Not because Eliza and Caleb didn't love each other. They did, fiercely and completely. But love didn't automatically translate into knowing how to share a life with another person after decades of being alone. It didn't erase old habits or fears or the deep-seated belief that needing someone made you vulnerable. The fight started small. Caleb worked late without telling her, leaving Eliza to sit through cold dinners wondering if something had happened. She rearranged his office without asking, trying to create order from chaos, and he snapped at her for touching his things. He made decisions about the ranch without consulting her. She made decisions about the household without consulting him. Little fractures that built into bigger ones. The first real fight happened 2 months after the wedding. Eliza had been going through the ranch ledgers. Caleb had finally given her access, acknowledging she should understand the finances if they were truly partners. What she found made her stomach drop. The ranch was failing, not dramatically, not obviously, but slowly bleeding money in ways that would eventually kill it. Expenses were too high, income too unpredictable, debt was mounting. She found Caleb in the barn that evening, his face drawn with exhaustion. We need to talk, she said. He looked up from the harness he was mending, instantly wary. About what? About the fact that this ranch is 6 months away from bankruptcy and you never told me. Caleb's jaw tightened. I have it handled. Do you? Because these numbers say otherwise. Eliza held up the ledger. You're borrowing against next year's profits to pay this year's debts. That's not sustainable. I know what I'm doing, Eliza. Then explain it to me. Make me understand how this works. It's not your concern. The words hit like a slap. Eliza stared at him, hurt shifting rapidly into anger. Not my concern. I'm your wife. This ranch is my home too. How is it not my concern? Because I built it, Caleb said, his voice rising. I've been running this place for 15 years without help, and I'll figure this out the same way. You're not alone anymore. That's the whole point of marriage. Marriage doesn't mean you get to second-guess every decision I make. It does when those decisions affect both of us. Eliza threw the ledger onto a nearby bench. You're drowning, Caleb. You're so busy trying to prove you can do everything yourself that you can't see you're sinking. I'm not drowning. I'm managing. You're failing, Eliza said bluntly, and you're too proud to admit it. Caleb's face went dark. Get out. What? I said get out. This is my barn, my ranch, my problem. If you can't trust me to handle it, then leave. The words hung between them, ugly and final. Eliza felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Fine, she said coldly.
Handle it yourself, just like you handle everything." She walked out, slamming the barn door hard enough to rattle the walls. That night, Caleb didn't come to bed. Eliza lay awake in the darkness, angry and hurt and terrified that maybe they'd made a mistake. Maybe love wasn't enough. Maybe two broken people couldn't actually fix each other just by wanting it badly enough. She found him the next morning asleep at the kitchen table, his face buried in his arms, the ledger open in front of him. He looked small in a way she'd never seen before, defeated, lost, utterly alone despite being surrounded by everything he'd built. Eliza made coffee quietly, then sat down across from him and waited. Caleb woke slowly, disoriented. When he saw her, something in his expression crumpled. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "Last night, I shouldn't have said those things. You're right, though. I overstepped." "No." Caleb sat up, running a hand through his hair. "You were right about all of it. The ranch is failing, and I don't know how to fix it, and I'm—" His voice broke. "I'm terrified, Eliza. This place is all I have. All I am. If I lose it, what's left?" Eliza reached across the table and took his hand. "Me. You'd still have me." "That's not enough." The words came out before he could stop them. Caleb's eyes went wide with horror, but the damage was done. Eliza pulled her hand back slowly. "I see." "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." She stood, feeling something crack in her chest. "And maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not enough to make up for losing everything else, but I thought—" Her voice shook. "I thought we were building something together, not me trying to fill the holes in your life while you keep all the important parts to yourself." "Eliza, I need to think," she said, "alone, for a while." She walked out before he could respond, before she could see whether he'd try to stop her or let her go. Eliza spent the day in her old cabin, the one she'd lived in before the wedding, now used for storage. She sat on the bed she used to sleep in and stared at the walls and tried to figure out what she'd gotten herself into. She loved Caleb. That wasn't in question, but loving someone and being able to build a life with them were two different things. And if he couldn't trust her with the real problems, if he saw her as something decorative rather than essential, then what were they doing? A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Ben stood outside, looking uncomfortable. "Boss asked me to check on you," he said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Neither is he." Ben invited himself inside, sitting heavily in the room's only chair. "You two are the most stubborn people I've ever met. It's exhausting." "I don't want to talk about it." "Too bad. I'm old and I've earned the right to meddle." Ben studied her with sharp eyes. "You know what Caleb's problem is? He can't let anyone help him?" "Close. His problem is he thinks needing people makes him weak. His whole life, everyone who was supposed to take care of him either left or died. So he decided the only person he could rely on was himself. Built this whole ranch as proof he didn't need anyone." Ben leaned forward. "Then you showed up and made him need you, and it scared him so bad he's been fighting it ever since. So what am I supposed to do? Just accept being shut out? No, you fight back. You make him see that needing you doesn't make him weaker. It makes him stronger. But you can't do that by walking away every time he gets scared and says something stupid." Ben's expression softened. "Marriage isn't about being perfect together. It's about being broken together and choosing to stay anyway." He said, "I'm not enough." He said losing the ranch would leave him with nothing but you, and that terrifies him because you're the only thing he's got, that he didn't build with his own hands. The only thing that could actually destroy him if he lost it. Ben stood, heading for the door. "Think about that before you decide what happens next." He left. Eliza sat alone with her thoughts and slowly, reluctantly, began to understand. Caleb wasn't pushing her away because she didn't matter. He was pushing her away because she mattered too much. Because loving her meant being vulnerable in ways the ranch never made him vulnerable. The ranch he could control. Her feelings, her choices, her potential to leave, those were variables he couldn't manage. And that terrified him. Eliza stood up, brushed off her dress, and went to find her husband. She found Caleb in the same place she'd left him, at the kitchen table, staring at the ledger like it held answers instead of just problems. He looked up when she entered, his expression wary and hopeful in equal measure. "I'm not leaving," Eliza said without preamble. "I'm angry and hurt and you were an ass, but I'm not leaving." Caleb's shoulders sagged with relief. I'm sorry, I didn't mean… Stop. Eliza held up a hand. Let me finish. I'm not leaving, but we need to fix this. Really fix it. Not just apologize and move on and pretend everything's fine until the next fight. How? By actually being partners. She sat down across from him. That means you tell me when things are bad instead of trying to handle everything alone. It means I get to help make decisions about the ranch because it's my home too. It means we fight together instead of you against the world with me just watching from the sidelines. I don't know how to do that. Neither do I, Eliza admitted. But we learn, together. That's the whole point. She reached for his hand. You said, I'm not enough to make up for losing the ranch. And you're right. I'm not. I can't be your whole world, Caleb. That's too much pressure for anyone. But I can be your partner while we figure out how to save it together. Caleb stared at their joined hands. What if we can't save it? Then we figure out what comes next. Together. Eliza squeezed his fingers. You're not alone anymore. Stop acting like you are. For a long moment, Caleb was silent. Then he stood, pulling Eliza up with him, and wrapped his arms around her so tightly it almost hurt. I'm scared, he whispered into her hair. I'm so scared of failing you, of losing everything and having nothing left to offer. You already have something to offer. You, that's always been enough. Eliza pulled back to look at him. The ranch is what you built, but it's not who you are. And if we lose it, we'll build something else, because that's what we do. We survive and we build and we keep going. Caleb's eyes were bright with unshed tears. How did you get so brave? I married a stubborn rancher who taught me that being scared doesn't mean you quit. She smiled. Now sit down and show me these ledgers. Let's figure out how bad it really is. They spent the next 6 hours going through every detail of the ranch finances. It was worse than Eliza had initially thought. Debts to 3 different creditors, outstanding bills for winter feed, equipment that needed replacing before it failed completely. But it wasn't hopeless. We could sell some of the land, Caleb said reluctantly. The northern section doesn't produce much anyway. Or we could lease it, Eliza countered. Keep ownership but get income from someone else working it. That could work, Caleb made a note. We'd need to cut costs somewhere else too. The crew's too big for what we're producing right now. We could manage with 10 men instead of 14. I'm not firing anyone. Then we find other work for them. Hire them out to neighboring ranches during slow seasons. They keep their jobs, we keep them on payroll, and everyone makes more money. Eliza tapped the ledger. And we diversify. Stop relying only on cattle. Add horses. You're good with them, and they're more profitable. Maybe chickens for eggs we can sell in town. Caleb was staring at her like she'd just performed magic. When did you learn about ranch economics? I've been paying attention for months. You just never asked what I thought. She softened her tone. I'm not trying to take over, but I spent years managing a bakery's books. Numbers are numbers, whether it's bread or cattle. I should have asked sooner. Yes, you should have. Eliza squeezed his hand. But you're asking now. That's what matters. They worked through dinner, through the evening, until they had a plan that felt possible. Not easy. Nothing about saving the ranch would be easy, but possible. When they finally went to bed, Caleb pulled Eliza against him with the kind of desperate relief that said he'd been afraid she wouldn't come back. Thank you, he whispered in the dark, for staying, for fighting, for not giving up on me even when I was being impossible. That's what love is, Eliza said quietly. Staying even when it's hard, fighting even when you want to run, choosing each other every single day. I choose you, Caleb said, every day, even the days I'm terrible at showing it. I choose you too. Eliza turned in his arms to face him. Now stop trying to do everything alone and let me help you. I'll try. That's all I'm asking. They fell asleep tangled together, and if the road ahead was still uncertain, at least they were facing it side by side. The changes started slowly. Caleb began including Eliza in ranch decisions, really including her, not just informing her after the fact. They sold the northern section to a neighboring rancher for enough money to pay off 2 creditors, leased other land, cut costs where possible without cutting corners. It was grueling work. Some days Eliza wondered if they'd made things worse instead of better. But slowly, painfully, the ranch began stabilizing. The crew adjusted to the changes with surprising grace. Ben took on more responsibility. Pete taught some of the younger hands skills they could hire out. Everyone pitched in because they could see Caleb and Eliza fighting for them instead of just fighting. And somewhere in all of it, the ranch stopped being just Caleb's place and became theirs. Eliza took over managing the books completely, freeing Caleb to focus on the land and animals. She started a kitchen garden that provided vegetables for the crew and extra to sell in town. She implemented systems that made the household run smoother, cheaper, better. Caleb learned to ask for her opinion instead of assuming he knew best. Learned to say, "I need help," without feeling like failure. Learned that being married meant actually sharing instead of just coexisting. They still fought, still had days where they drove each other crazy, but they learned to fight productively instead of destructively, to say, "I'm sorry," when they were wrong, and "I need space" when they needed it. They learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to be married. And then, 5 months after their wedding, Eliza missed her monthly bleeding. She waited another month before saying anything, terrified of being wrong. But when the second month came and went with no blood, she couldn't ignore it anymore. She told Caleb on a Sunday morning, both of them still in bed, the sun barely up. "I think I'm pregnant," she said quietly. Caleb went completely still beside her. "You think?" "I'm 2 months late. I'm never late. And I've been nauseous every morning for 3 weeks. She turned to look at him, trying to read his expression. "Say something." "I don't." Caleb sat up abruptly, running both hands through his hair. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor." "We should get a doctor. We should—" He stopped, seeming to realize he was spiraling. "How do you feel about this?" It was the right question. Eliza appreciated him asking instead of just assuming. "Terrified," she admitted. "I'm 35 years old. I've never been pregnant before. I don't know anything about babies, and the thought of bringing a child into all this uncertainty—" She gestured vaguely at the ranch, at their still fragile finances, at everything that could go wrong. "But," Caleb prompted gently, "but I also keep thinking about a little person who has your stubbornness and my practicality, about teaching them to ride horses and bake bread and survive Wyoming winters, about—" her voice cracked, "about building a family instead of just surviving alone, and that terrifies me even more than the pregnancy." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled Eliza into his arms, holding her against his chest. "We're going to be terrible at this," he said. "Probably. We don't know what we're doing. Not even a little bit. And we're definitely going to mess up." "Constantly," Eliza agreed. "But we'll figure it out," Caleb said, his voice gaining certainty, "the same way we figured out everything else. Together, badly, making it up as we go." Eliza tilted her head back to look at him. "You want this?" "Really?" "I'm terrified," Caleb admitted. "But yes, I want this. Want a family with you. Want—" He stopped, seeming overwhelmed. "I spent so long thinking I'd always be alone. And now I get to have you and maybe a child and an actual future instead of just survival. That's—" His voice broke. "That's more than I ever thought I'd deserve." "You deserve everything," Eliza said fiercely. "And so do I. And so will this baby." They held each other while morning light filled the room and the ranch woke up around them. Whatever came next, pregnancy, parenthood, all the ways they'd inevitably fail and succeed, they'd face it together. That was enough. The pregnancy was brutal. Eliza was sick constantly for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down. She lost weight instead of gaining it, leaving Caleb frantic with worry. The doctor they finally brought in said it was normal, that some women just had difficult pregnancies, but offered no solutions beyond waiting it out, so they waited. Caleb held her hair while she vomited, brought her crackers and weak tea, and sat beside her when she was too miserable to do anything but cry. The crew picked up her kitchen duties without complaint, taking turns cooking meals that ranged from edible to disastrous. Around month 4, the sickness finally eased. Eliza regained her appetite with a vengeance, eating everything in sight and slowly putting on weight. Her body changed in ways that fascinated and terrified her, her belly growing round, her breasts swelling, everything shifting to make room for new life. Caleb watched it all with something approaching awe. "You're growing a whole person," he said one night, his hand spread across her belly. I don't even have words for that." "Try terrifying," Eliza suggested. "That too." He kissed her stomach gently, "but also incredible." The baby kicked for the first time in month 5, a strange fluttering sensation that made Eliza gasp. She grabbed Caleb's hand and pressed it to the spot. "Did you feel that?" she asked. "No, wait. Yes." Caleb's face lit up like sunrise. "That's the baby? That's the baby?" They sat there for an hour, hands on Eliza's belly, waiting for more kicks. And when they came, stronger this time, more insistent, Caleb's eyes filled with tears. "We made that," he whispered. "You and me. We made a whole person." "We did," Eliza agreed, her own eyes wet. "Now we just have to figure out how to keep it alive." As Eliza's belly grew, the ranch continued its slow recovery. They weren't thriving yet, but they were stable. Bills were getting paid. Debts were shrinking. The crew was working more efficiently under the new system Eliza and Caleb had built together. People in Medicine Ridge noticed the changes. Some praised Caleb for finally getting his act together. Others credited Eliza for whipping him into shape. The truth was somewhere in between. Two people working together accomplished more than either could alone. News of the pregnancy spread through the territory like wildfire. Women Eliza barely knew started showing up with advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, offers to help. The Cowboys got protective in ways that were sweet and annoying in equal measure, treating her like she might shatter, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a dish rag. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Eliza snapped at Ben after he tried to carry her across a mud puddle. "Boss said to take care of you. Boss can mind his own business." But she was secretly touched. These rough men who'd once seen her as just the cook now treated her like family, like she mattered beyond her ability to feed them. The baby came in December, during a blizzard that rivaled the one that had brought Eliza to the ranch a year earlier. The contractions started at dawn. Eliza woke Caleb calmly, told him what was happening, and watched him immediately panic. "I'll get the doctor," he said, already reaching for his boots. "You won't make it to town in this storm." "Then what do we handle it ourselves." Eliza grabbed his hand, squeezing hard through a contraction. "Ben delivered calves. That's basically the same thing." "That is absolutely not the same thing. It's going to have to be." Another contraction hit, stronger this time. "Get Ben! Get clean water! Get—" She stopped, breathing through the pain. "Get everything ready because this baby's coming whether we're prepared or not." The next 12 hours were the longest of both their lives. Ben did his best, his face pale but determined. The other men hovered outside, useless but unwilling to leave. Caleb stayed beside Eliza the whole time, letting her crush his hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement even when she cursed him for getting her pregnant in the first place. The pain was worse than anything Eliza had imagined. Worse than sickness, worse than exhaustion, worse than every hard thing she'd ever endured. There were moments she was certain she was dying, moments she wanted to die just to make it stop. But Caleb never left. Never stopped telling her she could do this. Never stopped loving her even when she was at her absolute worst. The baby finally came just after sunset. A girl, tiny and red and screaming with impressive lung power. Ben cleaned her up with shaking hands and placed her on Eliza's chest. "She's perfect," he said, his voice rough. "You did it." Eliza stared down at the small person in her arms, this impossible, beautiful, terrifying thing she and Caleb had made. The baby had dark hair like Caleb and a nose like Eliza and tiny fingers that gripped with surprising strength. "Hi," Eliza whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hi, sweetheart. We've been waiting for you." Caleb had gone completely silent beside her. Eliza looked up to find him crying, actually sobbing, his whole body shaking as he stared at their daughter. "You can hold her," Eliza said gently. "I don't know how." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out." Caleb carefully, reverently took the baby in his arms. He held her like she was made of glass, his face a mixture of terror and wonder. "She's so small," he whispered. "She'll grow. What if I break her?" "You won't." The baby opened her eyes, dark blue, unfocused, and seemed to look directly at Caleb. He made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Hi," he said to his daughter. "I'm your dad. I'm going to mess this up a lot, but I promise I'll love you forever." The baby yawned, unimpressed, and fell asleep in his arms. They named her Sarah, after Caleb's mother. And if Eliza had once thought loving Caleb had changed her life, it was nothing compared to what loving Sarah did. The first few months were chaos. Sarah slept in fits and starts, waking every 2 hours to eat. Eliza was exhausted beyond anything she'd experienced before. Her body hurt from childbirth. Her breasts hurt from nursing. She cried at random moments from sheer overwhelm. But Caleb was there, walking Sarah when she wouldn't stop crying, changing diapers without complaint, taking her so Eliza could sleep for a few precious hours, learning to be a father the same way he'd learned everything else, through trial and error and stubborn determination. The crew helped too. Pete carved toys. Ben built a cradle. The Cowboys took turns making silly faces to get Sarah to smile. This rough collection of men who knew nothing about babies learned quickly because they loved the little girl who'd been born into their makeshift family. And slowly, impossibly, they figured it out. Sarah grew, started sleeping longer, started smiling and laughing and reaching for things. At 6 months, she could sit up on her own. At 9 months, she was crawling everywhere, getting into everything, keeping everyone constantly busy. Eliza watched Caleb with their daughter and fell in love with him all over again. He was gentle with Sarah in ways he'd never been gentle with anything else, patient when she cried, delighted by every small milestone, completely besotted in a way that would have been embarrassing if it wasn't so beautiful. "You're a good father," Eliza told him one night after they'd finally gotten Sarah to sleep. "I don't know what I'm doing half the time." "Nobody does. But you love her and you try and you show up every single day. That's what matters." Caleb pulled Eliza against him, both of them exhausted but content. "A year ago I was alone. Now I have you and Sarah and—" He stopped, overwhelmed. "How did I get this lucky?" "We both got lucky," Eliza said. "We found each other when we needed it most." "Think we can keep doing this? Raising a kid, running a ranch, staying married?" "Probably not," Eliza said honestly. "We'll mess up constantly, fight about stupid things, make terrible decisions, but we'll do it together. And that makes all the difference." 5 years passed in what felt like both forever and an instant. Sarah grew into a fierce, bright child who could ride a horse before she could write her name. She had Caleb's stubbornness and Eliza's practical nature and a laugh that could light up the darkest Wyoming winter. The ranch finally turned profitable again. Not hugely, but enough to feel secure. Enough to hire back some of the men they'd had to let go. Enough to start saving for Sarah's future. Eliza and Caleb learned how to be married. Really married. Not the desperate clinging of two lonely people, but the steady partnership of two people who'd built something real together. They still fought, still drove each other crazy, but they'd learned how to come back together afterward, how to say sorry and mean it, how to choose each other even on the days they didn't particularly like each other. They had 2 more children, a boy named James and another girl named Emma. The house filled with noise and chaos and life in ways Caleb had never imagined when he'd built it alone. And Eliza, who'd spent most of her life invisible, became the center around which everything else revolved. The crew looked to her for guidance. The children climbed on her constantly. Caleb still watched her across rooms like he couldn't quite believe she was real. One evening, 15 years after Caleb had knocked on her door during a blizzard, Eliza stood on the porch watching Sarah teach her younger siblings to ride. The sun was setting over the Wyoming mountains, painting everything gold. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "That woman in Medicine Ridge," Eliza said quietly. "The one who thought her life would never change, who couldn't imagine anyone would ever see her." "She was wrong," Caleb said. "She was," Eliza agreed. "But she was also brave enough to say yes when opportunity knocked. Brave enough to take a risk on a stranger in a blizzard. Brave enough to fight for something real instead of settling for safe." "I'm glad she was brave," Caleb said. "Because I wasn't. I spent years alone because I was too scared to need anyone. Then you showed up and made me brave too." Eliza turned in his arms to face him. 15 years of marriage had added gray to his beard and lines to his face, but his eyes still looked at her the same way they had that first morning, like she was worth choosing. "We saved each other," she said simply. "That's what love does. It saves you from yourself." Caleb kissed her, soft and familiar, while their children played and the ranch settled into evening around them. And Eliza thought about the life she'd built from nothing but courage and love. Thought about how being invisible had once felt like safety, but being seen felt like living. Thought about how the scariest thing she'd ever done, opening her door to a desperate stranger, had been the best decision of her entire life. Because real love wasn't about being perfect together. It was about being broken together and choosing to stay anyway. It was about fighting through the hard parts and celebrating the good parts and building something that mattered even when you had no idea what you were doing. It was about two lonely people recognizing each other in the dark and deciding to be brave enough to try. Sarah called out from the corral, waving excitedly as she helped James stay on his pony. Emma was chasing chickens, laughing with pure joy. "We did all right," Caleb said quietly, watching their children. "Didn't we?" "We did better than all right," Eliza said. "We built a family, built a home, built a life worth living." "Together," Caleb added. "Together," Eliza agreed. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. Not the ranch or the money or what other people thought. Just two people who'd found each other when they needed it most and built something beautiful from their broken pieces. The invisible woman from Medicine Ridge was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew her own worth, who understood that being seen wasn't dangerous, it was necessary, who'd learned that love required vulnerability and bravery and the willingness to keep choosing each other even when it was hard. As darkness fell over Ward Ranch, Eliza stood wrapped in Caleb's arms, surrounded by the family they'd created, and felt something she'd never expected to feel. Complete. Not because her life was perfect. It wasn't. Not because everything was easy. It never would be. But because she'd finally found the place where she belonged. The people who saw her. The love that made all the hard parts worth it. And sometimes, that was enough to build an entire life on.